On the morning of February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at. But all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxicabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan. And so taxicabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, to Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time, when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. Because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it, he slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people, and at that point he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually, Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and, mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks, because they both knew, Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like, something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude. Like, he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing, like not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people, he was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he'd begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? What's going on here? Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo like run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's gonna get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo, and to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party. And so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxicab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel, I'll give you a ride wherever you're gonna go, but then at night, you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxicab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxicab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxicab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxicab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town, and after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything. And it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, This was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet, and so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. So, starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder, maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something, because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues, and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Liao was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Liao was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Liao ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Liao came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Liao just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Liao was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Liao and said, "Hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us?" And Liao was like, "Of course I will. Of course I will." And so Detective Lin drove Liao to the police station, and when they got there, Liao was saying things like, "Oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here." Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, "Okay, yeah." And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room, and as they're walking there, Liao is saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, "Thank you so much, you're my savior, thank you." Now, the police had no idea why Liao was treating them like his saviors, because to them, they're like, "Dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you." But it would turn out Liao had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him. Because it would turn out Liao had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Liao had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Liao felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment, in a room that he couldn't quite see into, the sound of breathing. But Liao lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Liao knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Liao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then, as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Liao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, "Why? Why? Why?" And as Liao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted, hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Liao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Liao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do. He didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Liao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Liao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking, they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Liao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Leo actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Leo was brought by Detective Lynn to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Leo was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Leo's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Leo's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Leo was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. There was nothing. It was just Leo's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Leo because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Leo to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Leo did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Leo really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation. So he did give her a ride, just like he said he had. But Leo had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Leo stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Leo invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening. And while they were there, Leo did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Leo just let it go. But then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow and then cut her head off. Leo would bury her body the following night. But that same night was the first time Leo began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it. And then, not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment, screaming, why, at him. And so basically, Mariko's severed head began haunting Leo incessantly to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. He was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Leo in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Leo would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Leo was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Leo is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lynn, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lynn said at one point when he was inside of Leo's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. Just after 5 p.m. on Halloween 1957, in a Los Angeles suburb called Sun Valley, 35-year-old Peter Fabiano turned off the lights at his beauty salon, flipped the sign in a shop window from open to closed, and got into his car to begin the short drive home. Peter turned onto a long residential street and pulled into the driveway of a corner house at the end of the block. Peter put the car in park and just sat for a moment. As he stared at the Halloween decorations his wife had hung on the windows, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He couldn't believe this was his house. And to him, his house was sort of a symbol of how dramatically his life had recently changed. Just a few short years earlier, Peter had felt completely lost. He was living by himself and struggling to make ends meet. And that's when he got mixed up with some bad people who said he could make some money working for them. Even though Peter had agreed to do this, he had known it was not a smart decision, and he was quickly proven right when he ran into trouble with the law. Peter ultimately avoided doing jail time, but this had been a wake-up call for him. After that, he had worked hard to clean up his act and to really start planning for his future. And his hard work eventually paid off. Now he was married and ran a successful business, and he owned a brand new home that had literally just been built. In short, Peter Fabiano was living the American dream. And on top of that, he was enjoying the kind of personal freedom that he had personally fought for on the front lines during World War II. Life was good. Peter strolled up his front walkway between the rows of carved Halloween pumpkins and stepped inside his house. His wife Betty walked up to him, carrying a large bucket full of candy, and as she placed the candy on a table near the door, Peter gave his wife a peck on the cheek. Betty smiled and then quickly turned and walked away. And Peter wondered if maybe Betty's smile was forced, and if maybe she was mad about something. As happy as Peter was about his job and his new house in the suburbs, he and Betty's marriage had its share of difficulties. In fact, just that summer, a few months earlier, things had gotten so tense between them that Betty had moved out for a while. But she had come back, and things had really seemed like they were getting better between them. And so Peter decided to ask a simple question just to gauge Betty's mood. He said, "Hey, have any trick-or-treaters come by yet?" And to Peter's relief, Betty laughed and told him it was still too early. All the trick-or-treaters were probably still eating dinner. Peter relaxed, convinced he'd been reading way too much into his wife's smile, and he started to get excited about handing out candy to a parade of children in funny costumes. In the 1950s in the United States, the act of trick-or-treating had really started to become a popular Halloween tradition for children, and the holiday itself was growing into the huge part of American pop culture that it is today. When Peter was a kid, he didn't get to go trick-or-treating. It wasn't really a thing back then. But now, even though he was an adult, he was quite happy to be a part of it, even if his role was just handing out candy. Peter's teenage stepdaughter, Judy, came bounding out of her room in full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. Full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. By 6 o'clock, shortly after Judy had left for her party, the sun was setting and the Fabiano's doorbell rang for the first time that night. Peter and Betty heard a chorus of young voices chanting "Trick or treat" from right outside the door. Betty smiled, put on her pointy black witch's hat, grabbed the bucket of candy by its handles, and opened up the door. In front of her stood a little boy in a robot costume, and on either side of him were what Betty assumed were his two big sisters, both dressed as fairies. Betty reached into her bucket and grabbed as much candy as her hand could fit, and then dropped the candy into each of the kids' bags. The kids thanked her and ran off. At this point, Peter walked up behind Betty to look outside, and he saw more children approaching. And it looked like it was going to be a busy night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, after the last of the trick-or-treaters had come by the house, and Peter had picked up his stepdaughter Judy from her Halloween party, Peter walked into his bedroom and saw Betty reading in bed. He slipped into his pajamas and yawned. He thought about how he and Betty would have to be up at the crack of dawn tomorrow to get Judy to school, and also then to open the two salons they ran for a full day of appointments. And so all Peter wanted to do was just collapse and go to sleep. And so Peter slid into bed with Betty, but then put her book down on the nightstand and she turned off the lamp. As the couple lay in bed, Peter remarked to Betty that this time of the year was exhausting. Betty agreed. Decorating, hosting, entertaining, these things were hard work. She said now that Halloween was over, they would have to start sending invitations for Thanksgiving. And then as soon as Thanksgiving was over, they wouldn't even have time to breathe before they'd have to start decorating for Christmas and planning their big Christmas party. Peter joked that maybe next year they should just board up their house for the holidays and take an extended vacation. Betty started to laugh, but before she could say anything else, their doorbell rang. Peter sat up, switched on the lamp, and looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. He turned to Betty and said it seemed really strange that somebody would ring their doorbell so late. Betty thought it might just be a late trick-or-treater, even though more than 2 hours had passed since the last trick-or-treater had come by. Peter pushed himself out of bed. Maybe it was one of the earlier visitors coming back for seconds, he said. If so, it was their lucky night, because they still had more than enough candy to last through the new year. Peter put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and began walking towards the front door. And as he did, the doorbell rang again. And this time, Peter heard "trick or treat" from a voice calling out from the other side of the door. And so Peter picked up the bucket of candy on the side table, reached for the doorknob, and pulled the front door open. A few minutes later, Sun Valley police officer Bud Alper was fast asleep in his bed, 2 doors down from Peter and Betty's house, when suddenly this violent pounding noise jolted him awake. The pounding persisted as Alper slowly gained his bearings, and he realized that somebody was banging on the front door of his house. Alper picked up his watch from the nightstand and looked at the time, and when he saw how late it was, he instinctively began reaching for his service revolver. He had no idea what was going on, but someone banging on his door this late definitely couldn't be something good. But just then, he heard the sound of a young woman's voice, tearfully calling his name, pleading with him to open the door. Alper opened his front door, and through bleary eyes, he saw his teenage neighbor, Judy, the daughter of Betty Fabiano, standing there in her nightgown with tears streaming down her cheeks. Judy begged Alper to help her. Her stepfather had been shot, she said. He was lying on the floor of their house, dying. Alper ran out of the house and followed Judy to her front door and stopped just outside the doorway. Alper saw Peter lying motionless on the floor, partially blocking the entrance to the house. Alper quickly stepped over him and darted inside the house, and he saw Betty, Peter's wife, standing frozen in the hallway, with her hand over her mouth, looking like she was in shock. Alper asked where their phone was, and Judy pointed towards the kitchen. Five minutes later, an ambulance pulled up at the Fabiano's house, and paramedics picked Peter up, put him on a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Officer Bill Lehman of the Sun Valley Police Department parked his cruiser at the Fabiano house just as the ambulance left, and he walked up to the front door. Lehman greeted his fellow officer, Bud Alper, who was standing on the walkway in his pajama robe and lighting a cigarette. Standing near her was Mrs. Fabiano, who was sobbing, and when Officer Lehman approached her, she began to recount what had happened. Betty said that shortly after she and her husband had gone to bed, their doorbell had rang, and they both assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater. Betty said she had stayed in bed while Peter had gone to the door. From bed, Betty had heard her husband open the front door and say, "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" She then heard someone with a strange voice reply, "No," and a few seconds later, Betty heard a loud pop, followed by a thud. As Betty got out of bed and began running to the front of the house, she heard tires screeching and a car speeding away, and there, at the foot of the front door, she found her husband lying on the rug, bleeding from a wound in his chest. Betty told the officer that, based on the tone of her husband's voice after he opened the door, she was pretty sure that whoever he was talking to at the door was an adult, and she could almost swear that the voice she heard in response to him sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Lehman furrowed his eyebrows as he jotted down this strange detail in his notepad. Was the person at the door using a fake voice, because Peter would have recognized them otherwise? And if this was the case, did it mean they were also wearing some sort of costume? It was Halloween after all. Lehman walked back to his cruiser, reached inside of it, and then returned to the front door with a small box. He placed the box over the doorbell and secured it there with some tape. That way nobody could touch it before crime scene investigators showed up to dust for prints. Officer Lehman turned to Betty and asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Peter or wanted Peter dead. Betty hesitated just for a second and then shook her head. She said she couldn't think of anybody. A short time later, homicide detective Pat Keeley rolled up to the Fabiano house and took over the investigation. Officer Lehman briefed Detective Keeley on the details of what had happened, and then Keeley approached Betty. He took off his hat, lowered his head a bit, and said he hated to have to tell her this, but her husband Peter never regained consciousness, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Betty immediately broke down and began crying and hugged her daughter. Keeley stepped away to give the victim's grieving family members some space, and as the crime scene investigators showed up to process the scene, Keeley walked across the street to begin his neighborhood canvass. Keeley knocked on the door of the Fabianos' adjacent neighbors and asked if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. The neighbors told the detective that they had heard a loud pop, maybe about 15 minutes earlier, but aside from that, they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. As the detective scribbled this into his notepad, the neighbor suddenly remembered something he didn't think much of at the time. He said a couple of times that evening, when he would look out the window to see if there were any more trick-or-treaters coming, he noticed a car parked in the street that he'd never seen before. It was an older model, dark-colored sedan, and by his count, it had been parked there for maybe at least an hour, but now it was gone. The neighbor wished he could provide more information, but he didn't take note of the make or model, and he wasn't able to offer a description of anybody in the car. Keeley continued canvassing the neighborhood, but none of the other people on the block saw or heard anything unusual. So he returned to the Fabiano house, hoping that the crime scene investigators had found something useful that might help him close this case quickly. But the news from the other investigators was equally disappointing. There were no fingerprints on the doorbell, and no shell casings at the scene. In fact, they hadn't uncovered anything at all. Not a single piece of evidence. This crime scene was totally clean. A little later that night, Keeley returned to his desk in the homicide department to begin writing up the report. The 46-year-old veteran took a deep breath and exhaled in a long sigh. He knew he was in for a long night, and he was at an age where he was beginning to wonder if his 95% homicide clearance rate was worth the toll these long nights must be taking on his health. Keeley finished writing up the report and then began looking over what he'd written. He kept thinking how unusual it was that the killers took advantage of Halloween and used trick-or-treating as a ruse. He'd never heard of this happening before, except maybe in a radio play he once listened to. And the crime scene was so spotless. The killers were very careful to not leave anything behind. This suggested a level of planning and organization rarely seen in random killings and robberies. This had all the markings of a professional hit. The day after the murder, Detective Keeley drove down to the Hall of Justice and made his way to the Records Division. He wanted to find out if Peter had any sort of criminal background or maybe a connection to the mob that might have led a professional hitman to show up at his door and kill him. Keeley asked the records clerk for anything he could dig up on a Peter R. Fabiano. The records clerk disappeared into a back room, and a short time later, he returned with a file and handed it to Keeley. And the second Keeley opened that file up and began reading, he knew his instincts had paid off. Peter Fabiano did have a criminal record. About 9 years earlier, Peter had been a bookie, which meant he was setting up gambling bets, taking bet money, and paying out winnings. This was illegal, and Peter had been caught and convicted on a bookmaking charge. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but the sentence was ultimately suspended, and he never served any time. Keeley knew that bookies were often associated with organized crime, and he wondered how deep Peter's ties went. Could he have run afoul of a loan shark, or fallen in debt to the wrong people? Something like that would definitely support his professional killer theory. Detective Keeley spent the afternoon probing Peter's business records, his finances, his background, hoping to find other investigations and other shady dealings. Anything that might help Keeley build a list of Peter's potential enemies. But much to Keeley's surprise, aside from that one scrape with the law being a bookie almost a decade earlier, Peter really did seem to have cleaned up his life. He ran a legitimate business, which his wife helped him operate, and none of Peter's friends that Keeley had talked to could think of anyone who had beef with him. However, Keeley had yet to really have a deep conversation with the one person closest to Peter, and that would be Peter's wife and now widow, Betty. That evening, Betty Fabiano sat in a small room inside the Sun Valley police station. After waiting for a few minutes on her own, Detective Keeley walked in, sat down in a chair a few feet away from her, and asked her to take him through the night of Peter's murder again. Betty started recounting everything that had happened that day, starting from when she had finished working at one of the two salons she and Peter owned. Peter, at the time, was working at the other salon. Keeley listened closely, looking for any inconsistencies between this version of events and the story Betty had told him when he had first come to her house. Keeley was not ready to write off the idea that a hired killer had shot Peter, but maybe it wasn't the mob that hired them. Maybe it was the victim's wife. But as Betty spoke, Keeley didn't catch anything that strayed too far from her original story. Still, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Some people were good at memorizing stories. And so Keeley asked Betty to tell him more about her marriage to Peter. Betty explained that she and Peter had been married for about 3 years. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and one of those kids, her daughter Judy, lived with them. Keeley asked if she and Peter had any problems in their marriage. Betty paused, then took a deep breath, and admitted that, yes, there had been some marital problems. She said their marriage had become pretty rocky earlier that year, to the point where they actually had separated for a couple of months. Betty had moved out of the house during that time and went to live with a friend. But in July, she and Peter had reconciled, and she had moved back in with him. Betty looked away for a minute and was silent, and then she turned back to Keeley and said there was someone he should know about, someone who might have had it out for Peter. Keeley leaned in and asked her why she hadn't said anything about this person when he talked to her at the house. Betty said she wasn't trying to hide anything. She'd been in total shock at the house, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. But now that she was talking about her and Peter's relationship, it seemed obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did, obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did. In fact, the 2 women had quickly hit it off when they first met and had become friends. And this really bothered Peter. In fact, it bothered Peter so much that the friendship between Joan and Betty became a source of tension in their marriage, until Peter ultimately forbade his wife to socialize with Joan. Betty felt she had a right to choose her friends and was not going to let her husband control her, but Peter was insistent until Betty felt like he was basically giving her an ultimatum. And ultimately, this is the issue that led Betty and Peter to separate for those several months. However, Betty said after a couple of months of separation, she had a change of heart and returned home to Peter. And he accepted her back, but under the condition that she never see Joan and never even speak Joan's name around him again. As Keeley listened to the story, he found himself puzzled by it. It sounded like there had to be a piece missing somewhere. And so he asked Betty, why did Peter hate Joan so much? But Betty just sort of shrugged and looked away. Keeley couldn't tell if Betty was hiding this information because she knew more about Peter's murder than she was saying, or if she was trying to hide something to protect her dead husband or her friend Joan. Finally, Betty broke the silence and just said that Joan had a really strong personality, and Peter also had a strong personality. And sometimes 2 strong personalities can clash. The next morning, 2 days after Peter's murder, Keeley and his partner decided to pay Joan a surprise visit. They drove to Joan's house in Hollywood, on the other side of the hill, and knocked on her front door. The door swung open and Joan appeared, and as the detectives flashed their badges and said they were there to talk to her about Peter Fabiano, they watched Joan closely to see how she would react, whether she'd be nervous or surprised or something. But Joan just shook her head and looked down. She had already heard the news. How tragic, she said to the investigators. Keeley agreed and said it was tragic, but also her name had come up as a potential suspect, so they needed her to accompany them down to the station and answer some questions. Joan matter-of-factly just said, okay, and asked them to hold on a minute while she got her coat. And as she did that, the investigators shared a look, because honestly, this seemed really strange to them. In almost every homicide case they had ever worked, when somebody was told they were a potential suspect, they got scared or angry or had some kind of strong reaction. neither of the cops had ever seen someone act so unaffected by this kind of news. They followed Joan inside the house and kept an eye on her while she grabbed her coat and her purse. And she remained totally calm and cooperative when the detectives walked her to their car and drove her back to the valley to police headquarters. As soon as Joan was sitting down inside of the interview room across from Keeley and his partner, she began to talk. Joan insisted that she had nothing to do with Peter's murder. She was not a violent person, she hated guns. In fact, she had never even touched a gun, not once in her whole life. And as Joan continued to talk, Keeley began to notice her calm demeanor slip just a little. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded sort of surprised. She told the detectives she had no idea what they'd heard or who they'd heard it from, but she had no problem whatsoever with Peter Fabiano. She considered both Peter and his wife Betty to be two of her closest friends, and she had only stopped working at the salon because she'd found another job. So, Joan suggested, whoever was pointing the finger at her, the police might want to take a closer look at them. Keeley and his partner exchanged another brief glance. What Joan was saying was a complete contradiction to what Betty had said. Keeley's partner asked Joan if she had an alibi for the night of the murder. She told them she did. She said she had been home all night by herself, but her car had been parked in the front of her house in her driveway, and she was sure one of her neighbors could confirm that. After speaking to Joan for a bit longer, Keeley had his suspicions, but he had no legal reason to hold Joan, so he gave her a ride back to her house. And after Joan went inside and closed the door behind her, Keeley began knocking on her neighbors' doors. And several of them did confirm what Joan told detectives. On the night Peter died, Joan's car never left her driveway. And considering that her house was 12.5 miles away from the Fabiano house, it did seem likely if she was involved somehow in the murder that she would have had to drive there. Keeley returned to the station, went right to his desk, and shook his head in frustration. Less than 2 days into this investigation, and he felt as though the case was already reaching a dead end. Beyond Peter's brief stint as a bookie, nothing had come up that showed he still had ties to organized crime, or that he owed money to anybody. Betty and Joan had told him wildly different stories about Joan's relationship with Peter, so he figured one of them had to be lying. But the lie didn't have to mean they were connected to the murder. The lie could be for some personal reason. And at this point, there was no clear evidence pointing to either of the women. Keeley definitely couldn't rule them out, but he also couldn't really pursue either of them unless some new piece of information surfaced. So Keeley picked up his case file and began scouring the dozen or so pages he'd put together so far, looking for anything he might have missed. But after an hour of studying the facts of the case, he put down the file and felt no closer to an answer. Keeley's nearly perfect homicide clearance rate, which was a great source of professional pride to him, seemed like it was about to take a hit. Nearly a week after the murder, on November 5th, 1957, Peter Fabiano was laid to rest. Following the funeral, Detective Keeley continued to interview Peter's friends and family, but these conversations never seemed to get him anything new. Several more weeks passed, and no matter how many times Keeley looked over his case file, he didn't get any closer to figuring out who had murdered Peter. And with nothing more to go on, and new cases piling up, Detective Keeley and his team turned their attention to other open investigations. The Fabianos' Thanksgiving dinner that year had one fewer face at the table, and while they ate, there was this sense of despair hanging over all of them. Like Keeley, Peter's family started to feel that Peter's case would just never get solved. But on a day not long after Thanksgiving, in early December, the telephone rang at the Sun Valley Police Department. A muffled voice on the other end of the line told the dispatcher they had a tip in the Peter Fabiano case. The caller said that if investigators went to Bullock's department store in downtown Los Angeles and visited the area with the rented storage lockers, they would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. This was the gun that was used to kill Peter Fabiano. The caller then provided a locker number and then hung up without giving their name. The dispatcher took down the information and quickly passed it along to Detective Keeley. Keeley was skeptical that this tip would lead anywhere. Whenever a case was all over the news like this one, he usually got at least one call from somebody just looking for attention. Rarely was a vital piece of information just handed to him. It's never that easy. But Keeley was a diligent investigator who followed up on basically every single lead. And so far, the Fabiano case had offered very few. So this was something worth looking into. So Keeley and his partner drove to downtown Los Angeles, entered the Bullock's department store, and had the locker attendant open up the locker the tipster had indicated. And when Keeley looked inside that locker, he couldn't hide his excitement, because there inside of it was in fact a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Keeley asked the locker attendant whose name the locker had been rented under. The attendant opened a registration book, and when she read the name to Keeley, Keeley had never heard of them before. Keeley put the revolver into an evidence bag and drove it back to the station. He knew he would need to figure out where the gun came from, who the gun was registered to, and if the gun had ever been reported stolen. He also knew there was a good chance the locker had been rented under a false name, but he hoped the gun would still lead him to Peter's killer. So he called the state police and gave them the serial number of this gun. And within minutes, Keeley learned that the gun had been purchased on September 21st of that year, the month before the murder, from a gun shop in Pasadena, about 15 miles away. And the buyer of the gun was the very same person who rented the storage locker where the gun was found. This person had not used a fake name to get the gun or the locker. So Keeley could easily track them down, and he was now almost positive this person killed Peter. That evening, after obtaining a warrant, Detective Keeley and his partner arrested the person who had bought the gun and stored it in the locker. The detectives brought this person to the station and sat them down in the interrogation room, and as soon as the interview began, this person openly admitted to shooting Peter Fabiano. And they would tell investigators the entire story right from the very beginning all the way up to the aftermath of the killing. And once Keeley and his partner had all these details, all the pieces began falling into place. And everything that might have confused Keeley early on now suddenly made perfect sense. Based on the killer's confession and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Peter Fabiano on the night of October 31st, 1957. At around 9 p.m. that night, the killer, wearing face makeup and baggy clothes, sat in a parked car a few houses down from Peter's, and just watched and waited. Just after 11 p.m., so after sitting in the parked car for 2 straight hours, the killer saw the bedroom lights in the Fabiano house go off. At this point, the killer slipped a mask over their face and red gloves over their hands, and then climbed out of the car and began walking toward the Fabiano's front door, carrying a brown paper bag with a .38 caliber revolver hidden inside of it. The killer rang the doorbell, and as soon as they did, they began to shake, knowing they were about to commit a crime that could land them in the gas chamber. They tried to calm their nerves by reassuring themselves that this was the perfect crime and there was no way they'd get caught. They repeated this in their head as they rang the doorbell again and called out "Trick or treat" in a loud, booming, unnatural voice. Peter opened the door, looked at the killer in their ill-fitting clothes and paper mask, and laughed. "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" he asked. All the killer could think to say was "no," as Peter looked down into his bucket and began fishing for candy. With Peter's attention distracted for just a moment, the killer began raising the gun, which was still concealed inside the paper bag. But as they did, their hands began to tremble violently, so they reached over with their other hand to keep themselves steady, and then continued lifting the gun with both hands. And once it was aimed squarely at Peter's chest, they fired a single shot. The bullet blew a hole through the paper bag and slammed into Peter's chest, the round settling just below his heart. Peter looked up at the killer in horror and then clutched his chest as he fell to the ground. The killer immediately turned around, cut across the yard, and ran back to the car. When they got into the passenger seat, they were shaking and on the verge of tears. They couldn't believe they had just killed a man. But the killer then felt a hand on their shoulder. They turned to the driver's seat and saw the woman they loved had a smile on her face. The woman told the killer they had done everything just right. Then she hit the gas and sped away from the neighborhood. It would turn out Peter Fabiano's killer was a woman named Goldine Pizer. She was a 42-year-old lab assistant at a children's hospital, and she had no direct connection to Peter Fabiano. In fact, she had never met him before the night she killed him. She only knew what Peter looked like because another person had driven her by the Fabiano house a week before Halloween and pointed him out. And this other person was Goldine's only connection to Peter. And this other person was the actual mastermind behind the murder. And that was Peter's former employee, Joan Rabel. It turned out that Joan and Peter's wife Betty had both lied to police about their relationship. Joan and Betty were not just friends. They were lovers. But in 1957, that was not something most people would accept. So Betty and Joan tried to hide it. However, Peter still found out about their relationship, and when he did, he was livid. He fired Joan from his salon and forbade his wife from ever seeing Joan again. But instead of submitting, Betty left her husband and went to live with Joan. However, after a couple of months with Joan, Betty realized she was better off staying with Peter and broke off her relationship with Joan. Betty moved back in with Peter and agreed to never bring up Joan's name again. And it was at this point that Joan began plotting Peter's murder. Jilted and wanting revenge, Joan began a new relationship with the very impressionable Goldine and immediately began setting her up to become Peter's assassin. Joan spoke endlessly to Goldine about what an evil and vile person Peter Fabiano was. Joan claimed Peter was cruel to his wife and cruel to his wife's children, mistreated his employees, and was essentially a monster who needed to be stopped. Over time, Goldine grew to despise Peter just through Joan's portrait of him, and that's when Joan began actively putting her plan into motion. Goldine cared so deeply for Joan, she would have done just about anything for her. And so when she walked into that Pasadena gun shop on September 21st, she felt like she was doing a heroic thing. Once the two conspirators had their plan all worked out, they decided Halloween night was the best time to carry it out, because they knew Peter would be more likely to open his door to a stranger after a steady stream of trick-or-treaters had been to his house. On the night of the murder, Joan borrowed a friend's car, leaving hers in the driveway to create the alibi, and then went to pick up Goldine at her house. Joan then drove Goldine to the Fabiano street, waited in the car until the deed was done, and drove her back home. At which point, Joan told Goldine to forget they ever knew each other and vanished from her life. Once Goldine realized she'd been used and manipulated by Joan, who didn't actually care about her, the hold that Joan had over her was broken. So when Detective Keeley got the anonymous tip and tracked Goldine down, she was more than willing to tell him everything. Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were both charged with first-degree murder. Both women initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed their pleas to guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Joan and Goldine received sentences of 5 years to life in prison. As for Peter's widow, Betty Fabiano, she was never charged with any crime because investigators were satisfied that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. On a rainy spring day in Michigan in 2015, Kristen Rawlings served lunch to her 2.5-year-old son, Bobby. She set a colorful plate full of healthy foods from carrots to blueberries on the table right in front of him. But Bobby was not remotely interested in any of it. He just pushed the whole plate to the side, which didn't surprise Kristen because she knew what he really wanted: graham crackers and chocolate milk. Kristen knew her son was a picky eater. She did her best to make sure he ate healthy, but at the same time, she just didn't have the energy to make every meal a battle. So, on this day, she added a few of his favorite crackers to the plate and offered a small cup of chocolate milk, both of which he consumed immediately. Kristen felt guilty that her boy ate so many sweets, but she figured Bobby should at least have something in his stomach. Once Bobby was done eating, Kristen unsnapped the safety belt on his booster seat and he climbed down from the chair. Soon, he was playing happily with his toys on a nearby rug. As Kristen cleared away the lunch dishes, she watched her son stand up and walk over to his craft table. She noticed that Bobby was having trouble putting weight on his right leg, but he didn't act like he was in any pain. Kristen figured that his foot must have fallen asleep while he was sitting crisscross on the rug, so she left him alone while she finished cleaning up. A few weeks later, on a warm, sunny afternoon, Kristen gave Bobby one last big push in his favorite swing at the park. She smiled as he climbed down from the swing and ran towards the sandbox on the other side of the playground. Then, Kristen froze. She noticed something odd about the way Bobby was moving. He was barely letting his right foot touch the ground. It was like the second it made impact, he would quickly tuck it back up again, like he was protecting his right foot. Kristen ran to her son, concerned that he might have cut his foot on a rock or maybe a piece of glass hidden inside the sand. But when she reached him, Bobby wasn't crying, so she calmly asked him why he was walking like that. Bobby told her he was just trying to walk like the birds in the park. Kristen was a bit relieved that her son could just have been playing a game. But a few minutes later, she watched her son follow a group of kids towards the slide. She could see that his bird walk had stopped, but now he was doing something else. He was walking very stiff-legged, kind of like Frankenstein. Something definitely seemed wrong with Bobby, but Kristen told herself not to panic. If Bobby wasn't in pain, then she didn't want to waste time and money with an unnecessary doctor's appointment. However, she did decide she would keep a closer eye on Bobby in case his gait did not go back to normal. Bobby's condition did not improve, and early one morning the following week, Kristen woke up to the sound of him crying and coughing on the baby monitor. She hurried down the hall to his room and she sat with him on his small bed. She saw that he was clutching his right foot, so she took it in her hand and tried to massage it, but he immediately pulled it away from her grasp. For the first time, it seemed like her son was in pain. As Kristen rocked Bobby slowly back and forth, trying to calm him down, she noticed his back felt warm under his pajamas, almost like he had a fever. Once he stopped crying, she helped him slide off the bed and stand up. Then, Bobby walked over to his toy box with that same Frankenstein lurch Kristen had noticed in the park the week before. Kristen knew she couldn't put this off any longer. Something was wrong. It was time for a visit to the doctor. Later that day, Kristen held Bobby in her lap as she described Bobby's symptoms to the pediatrician. He told her that cold season typically lasted until early spring. He suspected that that was what Bobby was dealing with. The problem with his leg was concerning, and so the doctor asked her to lift Bobby onto the exam table. However, as soon as the doctor began to gently manipulate the boy's legs, Bobby began to cry. The doctor shook his head. The doctor told Kristen that based on this, he was going to order x-rays of Bobby's legs. Once the x-rays were complete, the doctor pulled up the results on a computer and showed the images to Kristen. He pointed to an area on the long, thin bone on the outside of Bobby's lower leg called the fibula. The doctor said the x-ray was not conclusive, but it did show that Bobby could have a minor fracture there. Kristen had no idea how Bobby could have hurt his leg this badly. He was rarely out of her sight. The doctor reassured her that children's bones usually heal quickly, and the injury did not require a cast. He suggested that Kristen watch Bobby closely and keep him from walking too much for several weeks. After that, they would retake the x-rays and see if Bobby's leg had improved. Almost a month later, Kristen used the shower head to rinse bubbles off her son as he sat in the empty tub following his bath. After he was rinsed off, Kristen wrapped him in a towel, lifted him out of the tub, and gently stood him on the bathroom rug. Immediately, Bobby cried out in pain and sank to the floor. This had happened several times since that visit to the pediatrician. Kristen had done her best to follow the doctor's suggestion to limit Bobby's activity over the last few weeks, hoping the pain in his right leg would go away. But instead, things seemed to have only gotten worse. Now, Bobby flinched and cried whenever she touched either of his legs, left or right. Kristen picked her crying son up and took him to his room. There, they sat on his bed together as she rocked him and wiped away his tears. Once Bobby stopped crying, he sniffled a bit and then smiled up at his mom. Kristen smiled back, but then it turned into a frown. She could see something strange inside of Bobby's mouth. Kristen gently pushed his lip up for a better look, and she saw there was a dark spot on the gums between his two front teeth. Kristen very softly wiped that spot with the towel until the black spot disappeared, but then his gums began to bleed. Kristen realized that the gum line in her son's entire mouth was very red and swollen. Whatever was wrong with Bobby, it seemed to be more than just his legs, and it appeared to be getting very serious very fast. So she got Bobby dressed, bundled him up, and headed to the nearest emergency room. About an hour later, at the ER of her local hospital, Kristen stood alongside the doctor as he examined her son. She was doing her best to keep Bobby still and quiet on his hospital bed so she could answer the doctor's questions. But Bobby cried out in pain every time the doctor gave either of his legs even the slightest touch. After a few minutes of this, Kristen noticed a very strange, unfriendly look come over the doctor's face. He called a nurse into the room and then abruptly pointed to a nearby chair and asked Kristen to take a seat. Kristen immediately sat down, like she'd been given a direct order. And now all she could do was watch as her son cried out for his mother from the exam table. And also, from this angle, she could see something alarming. Although Bobby was flailing his arms as he desperately reached for her, his legs were completely motionless. She realized that his legs only moved when the doctor manipulated them. The rest of the time, they lay flat and still on the table. Kristen felt a knot growing in her stomach. Then the doctor whispered something in the nurse's ear. Then the doctor asked the nurse to take Bobby for a CT scan right away to get a closer look at his leg bones. Kristen assumed she would stay with Bobby to comfort him during the procedure, so she grabbed her bag and stood as the nurse began to wheel Bobby out of the room. But the doctor stopped her and told her to stay and give him more detail on Bobby's medical history. Kristen could hear Bobby wailing as he disappeared down the hall. She knew it was important for the doctor to know as much as he could about this situation. So she did as she was told and sat back down and went through Bobby's entire medical history. She told the doctor that Bobby had developed normally as a baby, but she did note that he didn't begin talking as early as other kids his age. Her pediatrician had called it a slight speech delay, but believed he would catch up. Other than that, and the fact that he was a very picky eater like most kids his age, Kristen said Bobby was a healthy, happy kid. And he had been totally fine until 6 weeks ago when she had first noticed his leg pain. A moment later, the door to the exam room opened and a woman stepped inside. Kristen thought this might be a specialist the doctor had called in to discuss Bobby's case, but then the doctor excused himself, saying he would check on Bobby and return shortly. That's when Kristen noticed this woman was dressed in a formal blouse and slacks, not in scrubs like most doctors. She introduced herself to Kristen as a case manager for Child Protective Services, and then she sat down in the chair the doctor had just left. She told Kristen that according to state law, doctors were required to report any suspicions of child abuse, and it was her job to make sure Kristen was not hurting Bobby. Kristen tried not to show just how shocked she felt when she realized this woman thought she was hurting her own son, but at the same time, she knew she had to stay calm and not seem angry. So Kristen clenched her hands in her lap and began to answer the case manager's questions. About a half hour later, Kristen let out a deep breath as the Child Protective Services manager finally left the room. Kristen was relieved that the woman seemed satisfied with her answers. Now she was just anxious to get back to Bobby and make sure he was okay. Just then, Kristen heard the nurse talking to Bobby as she wheeled him down the hall back to their small hospital room. The doctor followed right behind them, and as he came in, he gave Kristen a small smile. She could tell it was his way of showing her that he knew she had not hurt Bobby after all. And the instant her boy came through the door, Kristen was by his side, realizing immediately how scared she had been they were going to take Bobby away from her. She squeezed her son's hand as the doctor called up the CT scan results on the computer. The doctor said the scan didn't show any broken bones. Whatever the previous doctor had seen on Bobby's x-rays, it most likely was not a fracture. Kristen sighed with relief. Then, the doctor said Bobby's lab results, they showed his red blood cells were low, and that he had severe anemia. Upon hearing this, Kristen actually felt sort of hopeful. Maybe Bobby's problems could be solved easily by treating the anemia with some iron pills. Maybe the worst of this thing was over. However, the doctor said that anemia would not explain Bobby's leg pain. He said that he wanted to rule out a rare neurological condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome that can cause numbness or even paralysis in the legs. This disorder occurs when the immune system that usually protects us from disease mistakenly attacks the body's own nerves. In Bobby's case, his immune system's attacks could be interfering with his muscle movement and possibly causing his weakness and pain. The doctor asked Kristen for permission to do a spinal tap because that was the only way to test for this condition, and a spinal tap would require him to use a needle and syringe to remove fluid from Bobby's spine. Kristen's heart began to beat faster at the thought of a needle in her child's spine, but she ultimately gave the doctor permission. She hoped that this latest test would finally tell them what was happening to her son. A few hours later, Kristen held a very relaxed Bobby in her arms as the doctor rubbed a numbing, and she heard Bobby stirring in his bed. So reflexively, she walked over and reached out to adjust Bobby's blanket so it covered him more. But as she did, she saw something that made her gasp and yell out for the doctor back in the hallway. The doctor immediately came in, snapped on the bright lights, and Kristen pointed to tiny red spots which had suddenly developed all over Bobby's face and neck, almost like Bobby had the measles. And one look at the doctor's startled face told Kristen that something was very wrong with her baby. As the sun began to rise a few hours later, Kristen climbed into an ambulance right beside the gurney that carried her son. They were headed to a pediatric hospital where specialists would soon review Bobby's case. She prayed that somebody there would be able to help him. Later that morning, Dr. Hall Johnson wore a fuzzy sheep puppet on his right hand as he examined his latest patient, Bobby. Dr. Johnson had long ago learned the value of distraction to treat the sick children he saw every day. But even his funniest sheep voice for his sheep puppet was not calming this little boy down at all. Bobby was thrashing and crying in his bed. Dr. Johnson had reviewed Bobby's records and saw that his red blood cell count was dangerously low, and so it made sense the boy was so pale. He was severely anemic. But one thing didn't make sense to the doctor. Children with severe anemia were usually too weak to throw a fit like this one. And even stranger, Bobby was only throwing a tantrum with his upper body. The doctor noticed that Bobby's legs weren't moving at all. They just laid there flat on the table in a wide open position like a frog's legs. But to Dr. Johnson's surprise, when he tapped under Bobby's knees with a small hammer, Bobby's legs kicked out in an exaggerated response. Bobby's legs clearly were not paralyzed. It was just that Bobby couldn't or wouldn't make them move. Bobby's gums were still swollen and red, too. As for the strange rash that had bloomed so suddenly at the emergency room, Dr. Johnson could see that it was actually tiny pinholes of blood coming to the surface of the skin, known as petechia. These little spots can be caused by lots of disorders, from bacterial infections to blood disorders. Dr. Johnson asked a nurse to tend to the unhappy child while he led Kristen to the nearby nurse's station. He could see she was as frazzled and exhausted as Bobby, so he tried to be gentle. He told her that after all the testing Bobby had been through, he still had no clear diagnosis here. The boy clearly had a multitude of worrisome symptoms, but so far, Dr. Johnson had not hit on one condition that could kind of explain them all. Dr. Johnson asked Kristen to prepare for her son to be admitted, because even more testing was ahead. Several blood tests later, Dr. Johnson sat at his computer, re-examining Bobby's x-rays. Dr. Johnson had run blood tests for an array of conditions, including lead poisoning and inflammation in Bobby's muscles or bones. But everything came back negative, and Dr. Johnson just felt stumped. So, Dr. Johnson began reviewing Bobby's case from the beginning, including taking another good look at the x-rays that had made Bobby's original doctor think he could have a broken fibula. As Dr. Johnson clicked through the x-rays on his screen, he noticed something strange. Some parts of the bones in Bobby's legs were darker than others. These dark lines, known as lucent bands, were a sign that Bobby's bones were developing unevenly, leaving some sections thinner and weaker and other sections thicker and stronger. This odd pattern on the x-ray pointed Dr. Johnson in a particular direction, but to confirm it, that would require more tests, and so he sent in the orders for them immediately. Then came the hard part. As the doctor pushed back from his desk and stepped into the hallway, he went over in his mind how he would break it to Kristen that her son needed a procedure that was likely to make her quite anxious. He knew Bobby had already had a spinal tap, a procedure that put a needle in his spine. Now, Dr. Johnson needed to perform a bone marrow biopsy. This meant he would have to sink an even bigger needle into Bobby's leg, push through to the core of the bone, and then draw out a piece of spongy marrow cells. Dr. Johnson would only ever order this test if he suspected something terrible, and unfortunately, he did. Lucent bands were a sign of leukemia, which meant Dr. Johnson was testing for cancer in the boy's blood and bone marrow. Later that day, Dr. Johnson waited anxiously in his office for the results of Bobby's bone marrow biopsy. And as soon as they hit his inbox and he read them, he was very relieved. And he picked up his phone and notified Kristen that the results had found no evidence of leukemia. Dr. Johnson could hear the relief in Kristen's voice, but he reminded himself that his work was not yet finished. Now that he had ruled out leukemia, he had to turn his attention to another area of suspicion that he had. This time, he needed to look at Bobby's leg bones as closely as possible. To do this, he ordered one more test, an MRI of Bobby's legs. He promised Kristen this was a painless procedure. A few hours later, the MRI results flashed across Dr. Johnson's computer screen, giving him a high-resolution cross-section view of Bobby's leg bones. And finally, he found exactly what he was looking for. The reason for the pain and weakness in Bobby's legs was very clear to see. The outer layer in both of Bobby's thigh bones had thickened and was pulling away from the rest of the bone. Dr. Johnson knew this was a sign of a debilitating condition that used to be common in the 18th century, but was now incredibly rare in kids in the US. It was so rare, most doctors had never even seen a single case of it. Dr. Johnson went back to Kristen to obtain additional information, this time specifically about Bobby's picky diet. And what Kristen told him allowed him to finally diagnose Bobby's condition. Dr. Johnson's hunch was correct. Bobby had scurvy. Scurvy is a disease that was first seen in the 15th century when European sailors began to take long voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, going months or even years without a proper diet. The illness began with the same symptoms Bobby presented: painful joints and bleeding gums, and then as the disease progressed, their teeth would get loose. They'd bleed from the mouth and nose, and their legs and ankles would swell. Finally, internal bleeding or infection would lead to a very painful death. On any given transatlantic ocean voyage at the time, at least half the sailors would die of scurvy. But in 1753, it was discovered that citrus fruits could prevent and cure scurvy. And so sea captains began bringing crates of oranges and limes on every long voyage. That's actually how British sailors got the nickname limeys. Scurvy is rarely seen today, but it does still exist. It's mostly found among older people or people with mental disorders who can't eat a varied, healthy diet. When Dr. Johnson asked Kristen about Bobby's diet, she revealed that on an average day, Bobby drank about a quart of chocolate milk and ate 2 to 4 graham crackers, and that was basically it. They were not just his favorite foods, they were practically all he ever ate. He did not eat meat, he didn't eat vegetables, and most importantly, he did not eat fruit. As a result, his diet lacked the one element crucial to life that humans cannot make or store. It must come through our daily diet. Bobby needed vitamin C. As soon as Dr. Johnson made his diagnosis, he started Bobby on doses of vitamin C. And just like the sailors of old, his symptoms began to reverse within a week. His gums stopped bleeding, and he started to use his legs again as the pain and swelling subsided. And finally, after 4 months, Bobby was back to normal. A little after noon on Valentine's Day 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked towards their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbor's house in the suburban neighborhood in Maryland where they lived, and now Steve and Kim had the whole weekend to themselves, and they were really excited about it because they had this big trip planned. Now, admittedly, Kim had no idea what they were actually going to be doing because Steve was the one who planned it, and he was obviously being very secretive about the details. He wanted this to be a surprise. And so for weeks leading up to this weekend, Kim would see Steve on the phone all the time, presumably planning whatever it is they were going to be doing, but he wouldn't let Kim hear what he was saying on the phone. He would kind of muffle his voice, or he'd hang up before she could come over and hear him. And then also after these secretive phone calls, Kim would often see Steve writing all these notes down in his journal, presumably about whatever it was he was planning. The only details Steve shared with Kim about this trip was, make sure you wear something nice. When the couple reached their car, Steve hopped in the driver's seat and Kim hopped in the passenger seat, and immediately, right after Steve had fired up the car, Kim turned to him and said, "Are you going to tell me? You going to tell me where we're going?" But Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim gave a theatrical sigh and sat back and feigned frustration, but But inside, the way she was really feeling was just excited. This was so cool that Steve had put so much effort into whatever it is they were going to do. But also, Kim was seeing her husband was really making a big effort to make her happy. And this was kind of new because lately, their relationship had been really rocky. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years by this point, and they were both very, very different people. Steve was a total homebody, kind of introverted, and Kim was the opposite. She was super extroverted and very social. But when they first met each other, it was actually their stark differences that brought them together. For Kim, when they met, she was in her early 20s, she had just dropped out of college, and her experience with men so far had been she would meet them at parties or bars, and at first it would seem like their relationship was great, but then invariably these guys would just kind of move on and break Kim's heart. But Steve was different. He was this huge guy, 6'4", massive football player, but he was totally a gentle giant. And as soon as he met Kim, Kim could tell this guy is different. He's treating her with respect. He's loyal to her. He really cares about her. And so they hit it off right away. And Kim very quickly became pregnant, at which point Steve asked her to marry him, and Kim didn't hesitate for a second. They were totally in love. And marriage to Steve had really been a stabilizing factor in Kim's life. She wound up going back to college and got her degree, which landed her a job as a surgical technician, which is what she did now. And Steve turned out to be just a fantastic father, and he wound up actually staying home with their daughter when she was a baby so Kim could go out and work. And Kim always thought it was funny when she would come home and she would see Steve standing in the doorway cradling this infant, but he's like this massive person, and so their baby looked like a toy. But unfortunately, over the last year, Kim had seen a change in Steve. He went from being a shy person, but a person who could go out and function in society, to a shy person who basically stopped going outside altogether. Steve basically refused to go out anywhere with Kim. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to spend time with their friends or family. He just wanted to stay home and watch TV or hang out in the basement. I mean, it was pretty obvious he was depressed, but his introvertedness was becoming kind of stifling for Kim. And so Kim approached Steve and said, "You really need to go to therapy to get better here. I'll go with you. We can do couples therapy." But Steve refused. And so finally, right around this past New Year, Kim decided she had just had enough. She was totally unhappy. She did not feel like Steve was going to change. And so Kim told Steve that she wanted to get divorced. And when Steve heard that, he realized the gravity of this situation. He knew Kim was unhappy with him, but he did not know she was thinking about separating. And so Steve kind of broke down and begged Kim to give him another chance. Let him prove to her that he will change, that he wants this marriage to work. And Kim said, okay. And so that was how Steve wound up planning this very secret getaway on Valentine's Day. This trip was supposed to be the start of their new and improved marriage, and so Kim was really excited and optimistic about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and began following signs towards the Eastern Shore, which is a waterfront area of Maryland that's very beautiful, that was located about 70 miles away from Steve and Kim's home. After driving for a few minutes, Steve pulled into the parking lot of the Harbortown Golf Resort. And as soon as he pulled into a spot and turned off the car, he clapped his hands and turned to Kim and said, "Okay, we're here." And Kim looked from her husband out to all the perfectly manicured grounds and the beautiful resort, and she smiled and leapt out of the car excitedly. Kim and Steve took each other's hands and marched inside to check in, and as they were checking in, the person behind the desk gave them glasses of champagne, and then after handing Kim and Steve their key cards, the receptionist told them that their cottage where they were staying was like the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were totally pumped. They took their champagne and their room keys, they walked back to their car, and then drove a little ways deeper into the resort to their cottage. It was cottage 506, and it looked out over the water. And when they went inside, Kim was totally wowed. It was this rustic suite with a wood fire stove in the middle and 2 queen-size beds and a little coffee table area for breakfast over here. It was perfect. And then when Kim actually walked into this cottage, she noticed there was a card sitting on a table, and it looked like a wedding invitation. Kim was confused and looked over at Steve, and Steve just smiled and said, "Go, check it out." And so an activity like this was perfect. And so Kim felt totally touched that clearly Steve had heard her, and the first thing he did to kind of win her back was to begin to do the things that Kim really wanted to do, which was really going out and having fun. And so after Kim finished reading the card, she turned and looked over at Steve, and Steve was kind of nervous because he wasn't sure if Kim was going to like it. And Kim, she broke into this huge smile. She walked over to Steve and gave him a big hug. And Steve, he was so happy, and he hugged her real tight right back. Kim and Steve would spend the next couple of hours sitting by their fire inside of their nice cottage, drinking their champagne and talking about the future and just telling stories and having a good time. And then around 7 p.m., Steve and Kim put on their nicest clothes and walked their way over to the area on the resort where this dinner theater was going to happen. It was in an event hall with a bunch of round tables set up for the audience. And so once Steve and Kim and the other audience members all took their seats, the actors and actresses came into the room, and they were all dressed in their wedding clothes. There was a bride and a groom and a wedding party, and the audience was instructed to participate in the wedding as if they were wedding guests. And so the audience all stood up, and they began kind of having this fake social hour of meeting all the wedding guests. And then Steve, Kim, and the audience members all took their seats, and they got ready to watch the drama unfold. And Kim, pretty much immediately, was totally absorbed in this performance. She was so enthusiastic, talking to the actors and talking to the other guests, and really pretending like she was part of the wedding. I mean, she was having a blast. The play itself was about a groom who was in the mafia, who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom stood up and gave a toast with his champagne. He took a sip and then fell down dead. Kim watched all of this with delight, but she kept looking over at Steve, hoping he too would be smiling and having a good time. But each time she looked at him, he was just kind of stone-faced and looking straight ahead, like he just didn't care or he was totally disinterested. And then a couple of times when Kim leaned over and said, "Hey, honey, who do you think did it? Who do you think the killer is?" Steve basically just completely ignored her. It was like she wasn't there and the play wasn't there. He was just totally zoned out. Eventually, Kim and a few other very enthusiastic audience members figured out the killer in the play was the bride's mother, who poisoned the groom, and then after this discovery was made, the play was over. As everyone got up from their seats and began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel really annoyed with Steve because he was just so silent and not invested in this play. And it's like, we came all the way here. Why aren't you at least pretending to enjoy this? But Kim also thought, Steve put a ton of effort into this weekend. He's clearly trying. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to bring it up. And so finally, Kim just said to Steve, "Hey, why don't we go to the bar and get a couple of drinks, bring them back to our cottage, and just hang out there for the night?" And when Steve heard this, he actually smiled and said, "Okay, great, let's do it." And by the time the couple got back to the front door of Cottage 506, they were holding hands again and laughing and telling stories, and they went inside and Steve put the beers down on the table, and then Kim said she was going to go in the bedroom and just quickly change into something more comfortable. And so Kim walked into the bedroom and shut the door, and Steve walked to the front door and turned the lock. 3 hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby, and he heard people saying there might be a fire at Cottage 506 and there could be somebody still inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin who was with him, and the two of them bolted outside and just started running towards Cottage 506. And as soon as they got to a place where they could see the cottage from a distance, they could see black, oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they got up to the burning cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He couldn't get inside. He screamed to see if anybody was in there, but there was no answer. And so Philip and the cousin ran around to the back of the cottage where there was a glass sliding door, and Philip, he tried the handle, but it was locked. At this point, the cousin said he was going to run back to the resort and get a fire extinguisher, and after the cousin ran off, Philip turned back towards the sliding glass door and realized it actually opened on both ends, and he had only checked one side and found that side to be locked, but on the other side, which he was now noticing, it was obviously unlocked because it was open just barely. And so Philip immediately opened it up and all the smoke began coming out, and so Philip dropped down to get a better look because down low the smoke had not fully settled. There was a bit of an air pocket right at the bottom of the floor, and so Philip got down and he looked inside, and for a second he couldn't quite see anything, but then he noticed in the middle of the bedroom, right inside this cottage, he could clearly see somebody's feet. Somebody was on the ground. And so Philip screamed that he was coming in, and then he opened the door the rest of the way, and he began low crawling into the bedroom. And as he did, he was hacking and coughing from all the smoke. And so finally, Philip reached this person, and he grabbed their foot, and he shook them to try to wake them up. but they weren't moving. But the fire was getting bigger and stronger. The smoke was getting thicker. Philip was really starting to panic and was worried that he too would get trapped in here. And so he just grabbed this person's leg and began pulling them. And it was really hard, but he finally got this person back to the door. He couldn't quite get them over that lip of where the sliding door was. But right then, Philip's cousin showed up, and the two of them were able to grab this person and get them out of the cottage. And this was the moment when Philip finally got a look at the person he was just dragging out. And it was immediately clear to him that this person was deceased. Their face was basically gone. It was completely burned away. In the days and weeks leading up to this weekend, Steve really was taking secret phone calls and writing notes down in his journal because he was planning something very special. But he was not the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what police say happened after Kim and Steve got back to their cottage following the show, and Kim went into the bedroom to change, and Steve went to the front door and locked it. A couple of minutes later, Kim came out of the bedroom wearing something sexy, and she looked at Steve and smiled and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." And so Steve's like, "Great, my plan is working. We're going to reconnect here." He climbed in bed and he laid down. And Kim, she walked over and got something out of her bag. And then she walked back over to the bed and she pulled out a syringe and she stabbed it into Steve before he could do anything. And she injected him with something called succinylcholine. Kim had access to this drug from her job as a surgical tech. Succinylcholine is used to relax people's muscles during surgery. But if you give someone too big a dose, it can stop their breathing. And this drug works pretty much instantly, which means Steve would have seen his wife stab him with that syringe, but then instantly he would have been totally paralyzed, but fully awake and fully alive. And so as he was laying there, he would have seen his wife put the syringe down and then grabbed lighter fluid and then walked over to him and calmly poured the lighter fluid all over Steve's face and chest. And then one of Steve's final images he likely saw before his lungs stopped working and he died was his wife striking a match and lighting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out the back sliding door. She shut it, leaving it open just a crack, and then she made her way to the resort lobby where she put on this big act about how her cottage was on fire and she thinks her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband might be inside the cottage, which is when he and his cousin jumped into action. They ran to the cottage and ultimately found Steve deceased inside of the cottage. Ultimately, Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger man who was in the Marines, and she was just done with Steve. And so as Steve began telling his friends and family how he was going to make a huge effort to save his marriage, Kim was going around to her friends and literally openly talking about how she wanted to murder her husband. But nobody took her seriously. They thought she was just kind of venting and being kind of dramatic. But as soon as the news broke that Steve had died in this fire and Kim had not, people rushed to the police to tell them, pretty sure Kim had something to do with this. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. It would turn out the primary reason why Steve was so secretive before going on this trip was he really wanted it to be this unbelievably special, romantic, kind of like recreation of the couple's first date. And so what he was doing is he was calling all of Kim's friends and family members and asking them questions about things Kim liked because he wanted to incorporate all of her interests in this trip. And then after these calls, when Steve was writing in his journal, that was not just writing down like logistics of the trip. He was also writing down how much he loved Kim and how excited he was for their future and what they would build together as a family. I mean, Steve really believed they were on a path to reconciliation. But of course, that just was not the case. 33-year-old Nicola Raybon was a nurse who also studied criminology in college. In January of 2012, she was thrilled to move into a new house in Lancashire with her partner John and her 2 kids. And then later that month, she and her family flew out to the Caribbean island of Antigua to attend her father's second marriage. And while she was excited for her father, she was mostly just excited about the pampering she was going to get from the 5-star hotel she was staying in. On the first night they arrived, Nicola went down to the bar to have a couple drinks with her friends. Now, Nicola was not known for being a big drinker or partier. In fact, she was more well known for her work with different charities and for being a really dedicated mother. In fact, one time, after her children were named mascots for a local soccer team, Nicola apparently lost sleep. She was so excited for them. After Nicola had a few drinks, her friends said they were going to leave and go to a restaurant to grab some dinner, and they asked her if she wanted to come. And Nicola declined, and she said, you know what, I'd rather just go watch the sunset up on the beach. You guys have a good time. After her friends left, Nicola walked up the steps onto the beach. She took her sandals off and took her phone out of her pocket, and she put them on a chair, and she walked off. Later that night, Nicola's father was supposed to meet up with his daughter, but when he went to their meeting spot, she didn't show up. And so he walked around the hotel asking different guests if they had seen her, and no one seemed to know where she was, but that group of friends that had sat with her at the bar, he found them, and they said, oh yeah, she went on the beach to watch the sunset. And so Nicola's father actually smiled to himself because he thought, great, I can go on the beach, find my daughter, and finally have a chance to have, a one-on-one conversation with her, because ever since I got to Antigua, I've been surrounded by guests and I barely had a chance to talk to her. And so Nicola's father walks up to the beach and he looks around and he doesn't see his daughter, and it's starting to get dark, so he figures, you know what, I'll give her a call. And so he calls his daughter and she doesn't pick up. And he thinks, okay, she probably just isn't looking at her phone. After that, he called Nicola's partner, John, and he picked up and he said, no, I haven't seen her. The last I heard, I thought she was going to the beach. That's what her friend said. And Nicola's father said, yeah, that's where I am and I can't find her, but I'm sure she's somewhere. And so after he hung up with John, Nicola's father went back into the hotel and he asked Nicola's kids if they had seen her, and they said no. And so now, feeling a little bit concerned, Nicola's father rounds up a couple of guests to go help him look for his daughter. And so they go up on the beach, and one of them quickly discovers Nicola's cell phone and sandals sitting on that chair near the hotel. And so right away, it just seems like this is a big red flag. She's out on the beach. We don't know where she is. She doesn't have her phone. And so now Nicola's father is really worried, and he calls the police. Then at some point, as the search party moved farther and farther down the beach, they heard the sound of someone screaming in the distance. And it sounded like a woman, and Nicola's father said it sounded like his daughter. And so they all start running in the direction of the screaming, but it's so far away and it's so dark that they can't make out who it is or even where they are. And after they ran down the beach a ways, the screaming just stopped. And so they really couldn't figure out who it was. And so everyone's just stumped and overwhelmed by the situation. And for the rest of the night, they just continued to look around the beach, and they never found the screaming woman, and they never found Nicola. The next morning, when the police were still on the beach looking for Nicola and now looking in the hotel as well, the tide went out, and that's when they discovered Nicola. After she left the bar, Nicola did go up onto the beach to watch the sunset, and she did it by going down to the water and just walking along the water's edge. And so as she walked away from the resort, watching this beautiful sunset, she walked deeper and deeper into the water until she was almost waist deep. And at some point, she hit a patch of quicksand and sunk into it. And so she began screaming and yelling for help, but no one could hear her because she was so far away from the resort. And so for hours, she sat there as the tide slowly came in, and she was just pinned, waiting to drown. And then finally, when people realized she was missing and that search party was within earshot of her, it was too late. The water levels were already at her neck, and by the time they actually got up pretty close to her, the water had gone over her head and she drowned. It turned out the search party was basically right next to her, but by the time they got there, she was already underwater, so they couldn't see her. Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake Stanfield loved going out in the wilderness with his father, Neil. The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive. And he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided? The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive, and he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided rafting trip? And Blake said, oh no, that's the wrong way to do this. We will not have a good time if we go with a group. We're doing this alone. And so Neil said, well, isn't that a little bit risky, just the two of us out in the middle of Alaska? And Blake said, don't worry, I've picked a river that by Alaskan standards is considered leisurely, so we'll be just fine. Neil was still hesitant about it, but the two of them were very competent outdoorsmen, and so ultimately he just went along with it. So later that year, in early July, Blake and Neil took a float plane out to the gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. This park is totally beautiful, but it's also very dangerous because it's full of grizzly bears and wolves, and it's also very remote. There's no people anywhere near this park. It's basically untouched wilderness. Adding to the isolation and danger, Blake and Neil did not have their cell phones or a radio. It was Blake's idea. He said it would be a good idea for us to just totally disconnect and just spend quality time together. And then also Blake had chosen a starting point on this river that was situated basically right in the middle of the park, which meant it was 60 miles away from the nearest human settlement. So after they got dropped off by this float plane and then the captain of that plane took off again, Blake and Neil loaded their stuff into their raft and then they hopped in and they started cruising down this river. At first, their trip was awesome. The weather was perfect, the landscape was beautiful, the water was totally calm, and Neil, he might have had reservations about the safety of this trip, but quickly he was overcome with just how peaceful it was and how wonderful it was to be with just his son out on the open water. And in fact, Blake had intentionally booked this trip 2 weeks before the start of the official rafting season in Alaska, which meant really there was nobody else in the water. It was just those two. And they thought, wow, what luck. Except it turns out there's a very specific reason why the rafting season starts when it does in Alaska, because that's the earliest the ice melts in the river and it becomes safe to travel on. After 2 hours of peace and tranquility out on this river, Blake and Neil started to notice these large ice chunks in the water ahead of them. And they were easy enough to get around, but as they kept moving, the current was picking up and these ice chunks got bigger and bigger until they started being these huge sheets all across the edges of the river where there was only a narrow strip of water they could travel through. And at some point, Neil asked Blake if it would be a good idea to just pull the raft over to the side of the river and get out and reassess the situation and see if we've reached an anomaly in the river where just this section is frozen, or if this is going to continue for a lot farther, and if so, we need to make alternative plans here. But Blake was not having it. He was stubborn, he wanted to keep going, and he was convinced he could maneuver the boat around the ice. And he said, let's just keep going a little bit farther. And so when they went a little bit farther, they reached a point where the current was so strong that they could no longer get out of the river. They had to ride it like a rapid until it stopped. And so as the father and son are fighting with each other about not having gotten out of the river while they still had a chance, they were not paying attention to what was in front of them. And they came around a corner and there was this huge ice shelf that was right across the whole river that basically blocked the whole path. And they turned at the last second. They couldn't do anything either way, but the nose of the raft went directly under the ice shelf and it flipped the raft onto its side, dumping Neil and Blake into frigid Alaskan waters underneath the ice shelf. And Blake would later say that he really believed that this was it. He didn't know how far this ice shelf was going to go on for, and so he assumed, I'm about to drown. But they managed to hit this air pocket inside of this ice shelf. The ice basically formed up at a bow and they both happened to pop up into it and they gripped onto the ice. And they're looking at each other and they have no idea how long this ice shelf continues, but the current is pulling them and they know it's just a matter of time before they get sucked under and go back under the ice. And so they look at each other and they don't really know what to say, but it's kind of obvious that they think they're about to drown. And then at some point, Neil gets sucked under and swept away, and then Blake follows shortly after. And then fortunately, they only tumbled along for about 10 or 15 more feet before they popped up again. But much like the boat that could not paddle out of the river because of how strong the current was, Blake and Neil could not get out of the river in time before they hit yet another ice shelf. And the next ice shelf was much longer than the first. And so they knew it was going to happen. They grabbed onto the ice shelf and they're holding on and they're trying to pull themselves back out, but the current's too strong. And at some point, they each had to take a big breath and then let go and got pulled directly under the ice. And so the whole time they're pressing their face up against the underside of this ice in hopes they find an air pocket, but they don't. And so the whole time they're just desperately looking for air and they're bumping into the underside of the ice. They have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And so after what felt like an eternity, Blake finally gets shot out the backside of this huge ice shelf. And he's still in the river, but there's no more ice shelves in front of him and the current had slowed down a little bit. So he was able to make his way to the edge and get out of the water. and he turned to face the water, and his dad was nowhere to be found. And so Blake turns, and he doesn't see his father coming out of the ice. He doesn't know if he's still under, if he came out again. And so he turns and runs downstream in hopes that he might have come out already. And sure enough, he found his dad clutching a rock in the middle of this river farther up. His head was badly bleeding, but he was alive. And so Blake grabbed a stick and was able to bring his father back into shore. Even though they had survived being pulled under the ice, they now had no equipment, no gear, no food, no water, no anything, because it was pulled under the water. And they were soaking wet and becoming hypothermic. And they're in the middle of nowhere with no one nearby to help them. And no one's expecting them for a week. And no planes are going to be in the area for 2 weeks. Fortunately, Blake had a lighter in his pocket that worked, and so they were able to start a fire and stay warm, and they were able to scare away grizzly bears and wolves. Blake finally walked away from their campsite, which was up on a mountain, and he went down to this river where he was able to flag down a float plane that was not even scheduled to be in the area. It was just totally random, and they saw Blake, they came back, they picked him up, and both men were just fine. They did say that even though the trip was a complete disaster and nearly killed both of them, it did reconnect them in a way that few things could, and their relationship is good as ever. But they both say they will never go rafting again. On July 10th, 1941, a brand new British submarine was commissioned called HMS Umpire. 9 days later, on July 19th, the submarine and her crew were told to meet up with a convoy moving north along the Medway River in England and make their way to Scotland. So Umpire joined up with the convoy, but then they started having engine problems that night, and they began drifting back behind the convoy until they were basically not in the convoy anymore at all. During this time, the commander of the submarine was up in the bridge, which is the area that controls the submarine when it's above surface, just above the wing. The captain of the Umpire was concerned this convoy would not see them when they came through because they were a submarine, so they're sitting low in the water and they're already all dark. They have no lights on the outside on purpose, because this was during World War II and they didn't want German ships or planes to spot them. And because of their engine problems, they had drifted away from their convoy, which would have been protection. So the captain decides to deviate from their course to get the submarine clearly out of the way of this convoy. And so when he started turning the submarine, the steering broke, leaving the submarine now turned so its entire side is now facing this convoy, and they were still drifting directly towards this convoy. And so sure enough, before the captain could do anything, one of the larger ships struck the side of the submarine, immediately flooding their forward torpedo room. And for a brief second, the submarine and the ship were kind of mangled together, and then it slipped off the ship and it sunk all the way to the bottom, 18 meters down. The captain, along with the other 3 men that were up on the bridge with him when they were struck, they managed to leap out at the last second and were treading water when this all happened. As for the other 34 crew members, they were stuck inside when it sunk. A number of the crew had been sleeping at the time of the crash, and so all they felt was this crash, the power goes out, they leap out of their beds, and they're landing in waist-deep water, and they're running out into the halls kind of fumbling around because they can't see anything, and all they can hear is the sound of water pouring inside of their submarine. And so these sailors had gone through all sorts of drills to prepare for this type of scenario where, power's out and you're sinking, and so they know by touch how to get to the one area that has an escape hatch, which is the engine room. And after 20 of them got inside the engine room, the water levels in the hallway were getting so high that it was spilling into that room, and it was getting to the point where if they didn't seal the door. And so these sailors had gone through all sorts of drills to prepare for this type of scenario where, power's out and you're sinking, and so they know by touch how to get to the one area that has an escape hatch, which is the engine room. And after 20 of them got inside the engine room, the water levels in the hallway were getting so high that it was spilling into that room, and it was getting to the point where if they didn't seal the door, they were going to flood this one room that was their only chance of survival. And so they had to make the heartbreaking decision to lock and seal that door, meaning the 14 other sailors on the other side, if they hadn't already died, were now condemned. But for the 20 men who now were going to be able to use this escape hatch, there was no guarantee that would work. Because to use the escape hatch on a submarine, you need to understand how it works. You can't just open a hatch on a submarine. It won't open. The pressure from the seawater presses down on it to where it literally cannot open. You might be able to open it a crack if you use a tool, but that's about it. In order to open the escape hatch, you need to use something called a lockout chamber. And so a lockout chamber is like this really tight claustrophobia-inducing thing that looks an awful lot like a gas chamber, where you step through one hatch and you shut it and you seal it so it's watertight, and then above you is your escape hatch. but you can't open it until the pressure inside of the chamber has been equalized. And the way they do that is they flood the inside of the chamber the escapee is in. And so you're standing inside of this tight space, totally sealed in, and there's a control panel inside the chamber itself and also inside the sub, if you're lucky enough to have someone do that for you. You turn on the chamber, at which point water is dumped inside of this tight space you're in until it's completely full and you're holding your breath, at which point you've now equalized. The pressure inside the chamber is equal to that outside, and you can actually open the hatch. So the person inside on a breath hold undoes the hatch, opens it up, and then hopefully your swim isn't too far because you're already on a breath hold, and you swim to the surface. And during World War II, submariners were outfitted with a special piece of equipment if they ever needed to leave via the escape hatch, and it was their Davis escape gear, which is basically this life jacket that's uninflated, and when you manually activate it, it suddenly inflates, and so when you go through that hatch, you would activate it, and it would assist you to get to the surface. And so after those 20 sailors had decided to seal off the engine room, they immediately shifted focus and began getting guys into the escape hatch, and one of their most junior sailors, a guy by the name of Killian, said he would stay inside the room and operate the control panel so everybody else had the best chance of getting out of the escape hatch. And so sure enough, he put all 19 into the hatch and he got them out of the submarine. And then he, on his own, had to get in the hatch, seal it himself, and control the panel in total darkness, flood the space, open it up, and shoot to the surface. He would live, and he would be awarded the British Empire Medal for bravery. One junior officer named Edward Jones was one of the 14 men that did not get to the engine room before they sealed it off. And when he got there and realized the situation, he turned around and looked down the hall, and there were only 3 other men that were standing there. And he didn't know how many had made it in the engine room. He figured this was the only 4 that had not made the cut. But in fact, there was actually 10 other people that were just stuck in various places inside of the submarine. But Jones decided he only had these guys in front of him, and so he said, "Hey, come with me, I have an idea." As Jones led them down this hallway, the water levels had risen up to their necks, and all these circuits on the walls were starting to spark all around them. And so Jones led them to the middle of the submarine, and then he turned and went up into the control room, and then from the control room, he went even farther up into what's called the conning tower. The conning tower is a submarine's main attack center. It's where you have those periscopes they look around in, and it also has the firing buttons for their torpedoes. It is not designed to be an escape hatch, because once you flood the conning tower, there's no control panel like there is on an escape hatch to drain the water that was used to equalize in order to open the hatch. So once the water's in, it's either you get to the surface or you drown. Also, in order to exit out of the conning tower, you need to go through this very narrow tube that goes straight up, and it's got a ladder through it that can barely fit one person climbing up, meaning the people at the bottom of the ladder will have to hold their breath a lot longer than the people at the top. So Jones and the other 3 sailors, they get to the conning tower and they seal the hatch at their feet, so blocking the hallway flood from coming into where they are. And they realize that even though they have to do this, there are no other alternatives here, that realistically 1 or 2 or more are going to die in the process of just trying to get out of the submarine. But it was all they could do, so they made peace with their decision. They climbed up and they opened the hatch just enough to let water come in, but quite a bit started coming in. The men wedged themselves as high up in the tunnel as they possibly could, but obviously not everybody could get all the way up to the hatch. And so 2 were down low, and Edward Jones and 1 other were up towards the top. And Jones would say that at first they were talking and praying, and then when they started feeling the water get closer and closer to their heads, they went silent. And then Jones remembers keeping his hand on the 1 man that was below him, and when his hand was wet, he knew the 2 men below him were completely submerged. And then the water came up to his face, covered his head, and at that point he opened it up and they swam out. Of the 4 men in the conning tower, only Edward Jones and the other guy who was high up in the tunnel with him made it to the surface. All told, only 14 of the 38 total crew survived the accident. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode,
Spacesuit, perfect insulation for me, keeps out all my painful memories like 3 thick coats of outer armor, lost in orbit, slaving over small talk. I'm on pause. I'm on pause.
Let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button to deepen the defensive trench around OP Rock, and you can tell them that in exchange for their work, they can keep any of the artifacts they dig up out of the ground. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch, on the evening of November 2nd, 1888, a 45-year-old man named Hipólito Hoyos got dressed in a 3-piece suit in the bedroom of his very cramped apartment in Paris, France. In the next room, he could hear his wife, Alphonsine, cooking dinner, while their 3 young kids ran around playing. And even though this really should have felt like a happy, idyllic moment, Hipólito instead felt this pang of worry, because keeping this family afloat was his responsibility. And recently, he'd had a very hard time doing that. So Hipólito had grown up on a farm in Belgium, and when he was younger, he'd gotten into some trouble with the law and basically had a really tough time kind of finding his way in life. But about 10 years ago, he had moved to France and he had met Alphonsine, and he also found a steady job running a farm for a wealthy French noble in the countryside. Now, Hipólito knew a lot about agriculture. He'd grown up on a farm. So in theory, this job really should have been perfect for him. But the problem was, no one on the farm really liked him. And it was true, he'd been very strict with the farmhands. But a lot of them had taken that sternness and they had gone to their boss and complained about him, saying that he was overbearing and very difficult to work with. So last month, when Hipólito's contract was up and he was expecting his boss would renew it, his boss didn't. And so now Hipólito's, perfect life, this amazing life he had built for himself here in France with Alphonsine, felt like it was falling apart. And so following not getting his contract renewed, Hipólito and his wife and their kids had moved to Paris so he could look for other work. But luckily they'd also found this very cheap but luckily furnished apartment just the week before, so they at least had a place to live, but Hipólito still needed work. Now, this new neighborhood they were in, understandably, because it was so cheap, it was largely full of, working class people. And there were lots of factories and lots of warehouses. So it was sort of a little bit rough and tumble compared to what Hipólito had become accustomed to, working for this nobleman out in the countryside. I mean, Hipólito, he wasn't crazy about the area. He had expensive tastes, even though he didn't have an expensive budget. However, Hipólito knew that this whole situation was just temporary. Because, after all, he was about to come into a huge windfall. And he actually had to travel outside of Paris right now to actually get the money, which was what he was currently getting dressed for. And so on this trip, his friend, 52-year-old Louis Baron, would be accompanying him, at least for a portion of the trip, because he was going the same way for a job interview that Hipólito had actually helped set up for him. Now, Louis was also from Belgium, and so he had known Hipólito for a long time, but things were tense between them at the moment. Hipólito had arranged for Louis to work on the farm that he used to manage, but when Hipólito was fired, it had also cost Louis his job there as well. The reality was, Louis was quite furious. I mean, he was really upset about it, to the point where Hipólito had actually helped pay for a room at a hotel just a few blocks away from his apartment in Paris for Louis. And he'd even let Louis borrow one of his suits to wear to this job interview. And so really, Hipólito was hopeful that by the end of this trip he was going on, his buddy Louis would finally just stop being mad at him. That was causing lots of problems. So now, after getting dressed in his fancy suit, Hipólito packed up a bag with some extra clothes and some cash, and he put on a hat. Then he went into the kitchen to kiss Alphonsine goodbye. She kissed him back, but she definitely seemed a little bit anxious, and Hipólito figured she was just thinking about being left alone with their 3 small kids. So he just reassured her that, this trip, this was all going to be worth it. Like, don't worry about a thing. I'll be back soon. Then he said goodbye to the kids and then left for the train station. Just after dark that night, Hippolyta stepped off a train at the station in Chantilly, which is about 30 miles north of Paris. Louis was with him and already dressed for his interview in the suit that Hippolyta had given him. And as the 2 men walked across the platform, Hippolyta noticed that Louis was moving sort of slowly and awkwardly, like he was uncomfortable in the suit, like he wasn't used to dressing that way. The men left the station on foot and continued walking down the road towards Senlis, the little town where they were both spending the night. It was about a 6-mile walk to get there, and once they got outside of Chantilly, the road was surrounded almost entirely by woods. It was dark and it was late, so there weren't many people that were out and about, and the 2 men didn't talk much, so the walk was very quiet. Eventually, as they were approaching Senlis, they came to this narrow stone bridge with metal railings on either side that passed over a railroad track. And as they reached it, Hippolyta heard this rustling in the trees. He stopped and he listened, and as he did, he felt his heart start to pound because this whole walk has been just like eerily quiet, and so to hear anything was just sort of alarming. But as he stood there listening, he couldn't hear it anymore, so he decided he must be imagining things. Now, Louis did not appear to hear the sounds at all, and he was still walking ahead across the bridge. So Hippolyta, he took a deep breath and then hurried onto the bridge to catch up with him. The next morning, 2 road maintenance workers were hauling a gravel-filled cart down that same wooded road that connected Chantilly and Senlis, the road that Louis and Hippolyta had been on the night before. And so these workers were looking for potholes that they would fill in with this gravel. And so they're moving along, they're filling in potholes, and then eventually they got to that narrow bridge by Senlis. And when they did, one of them noticed a man's hat lying near the bridge's railing. And as they got near the hat, they looked on the pavement and saw these dark splatters of blood. Now, the workers were immediately on edge. They're looking around. They don't see anybody. But at some point, one of them looked over the railing. And when he saw what was down below, he immediately shouted that they had to go tell the police. Later that morning, a judge named Jean Auberton walked down a small hill by some railroad tracks. At the bottom, a police officer and 2 road maintenance workers stood next to the tracks, staring down at a dead body. So, in France at the time, judges were responsible for leading investigations instead of police. So Auberton would essentially function as the lead detective on this case. And all he'd been told so far was that a body had been found on this stretch of train tracks, and he really didn't know what to expect beyond that. When Auberton reached the group down below, the police officer explained that the 2 workers, the road maintenance workers, had found the body that morning. They'd flagged down a train conductor who had stopped just in time and then waited for them to move the body off the tracks, and then the conductor kept going in his train and notified the police at the next station. And so Auberton, he knelt down to get a better look at the body. And, right away he could tell that it was clearly a man with blonde hair and that he was wearing a nice 3-piece suit, but that was really about all he could conclude because his face was just completely mangled. And his head was almost completely severed from his body. Many of his teeth were also broken, and there was also a deep gash on his left foot near his ankle. Now, at first glance, Auberton wondered if he had just jumped off the bridge and got hit by a train. But when he looked closer, the pattern of the wounds on his face just did not look like they'd been caused by a train. These were long, distinct gashes going in multiple different directions. It looked more like this man had been attacked with a sharp weapon, like an axe or something. And Auberton's best guess was that whatever happened to this guy very likely happened the night before. There wasn't much decomposition, and this railroad line got a lot of traffic. So the body couldn't have been here for very long, or another train conductor would have seen him earlier, or maybe wouldn't have seen him and then run him over, and then, his body would be completely mangled. As Auberton stood up, one of the workers told him that they had seen blood up on the bridge. So Auberton, he climbed up the small hill onto the bridge, and he saw that hat that was lying by the railing, and then just a ton of blood all around the hat on the ground. And to Auberton, there was so much blood up here that he figured his theory that this guy was attacked had to have been right here. He very likely was attacked right here on the bridge. and he either fell over the edge during the assault, or maybe after the assault, his killer threw his body, maybe to make it look like a suicide, or perhaps to dispose of evidence. And so at this point, Overton felt pretty much certain that this was a homicide, and he knew he would have to identify this victim as soon as possible. On the afternoon of November 4th, 1888, the day after a man's body was found mangled in the woods near Senlis, France, Judge Overton walked down a busy street in a working-class part of Paris. Now, by this point, he'd already gotten the autopsy results back, but they didn't really tell him much that he didn't already know, which was that the victim had been killed by multiple strikes from a sharp weapon, like a hatchet. Now, even though the body itself had not given Overton too much to go on for this investigation, the clothes that the victim had on had given him something. Overton had spent the past day piecing together clues that he had found in the victim's pockets, including a piece of paper with an address to a location in Paris and the initials HH embroidered on a handkerchief. And at this point, Overton knew what HH meant. It was the initials for the victim, Hippolyta Hoyos. Overton had gone to that address in Paris from that piece of paper, and he found it belonged to an acquaintance of Hippolyta's. And this person had not only identified Hippolyta, but also he gave Overton Hippolyta's last known address, where he had lived with his family. And Overton was right outside of that address now. But as he looked up at the building that matched the address he'd been given, he wondered if he had the wrong place. The man whose body had been found was wearing this really nice suit, and looked like he was upper class, based on the suit. And this was definitely not an upper class place to live. This was not a nice area. But Overton went inside anyways, and he walked up a flight of stairs, and then he knocked on the door of the apartment number that he'd been given. Seconds later, a very tired-looking woman answered the door, bouncing a toddler on her hip, and Overton asked her if this was the home of Hippolyta Hoyos. And the woman just kind of frowned and said yes, she was actually his wife, Alphonsine. Overton kept it simple and just said that he was a judge and he was conducting an investigation, and asked if he could come in. Alphonsine got this uneasy look on her face, but she nodded and said come on in. Once they'd both sat down at the dining room table, Overton told her that the investigation he was doing was for a homicide, that a body had been found in the woods near Senlis, France, and he believed, unfortunately, the body belonged to her husband, Hippolyta. And to Overton's surprise, Alphonsine just didn't seem very upset at all. She just sat there expressionless, as Overton went on to explain a little bit further, what actually happened, that, the body had been found on some train tracks, and it appeared like that he had been attacked. Someone had clearly killed him. And as Overton did this, he kept waiting for Alphonsine to cry or gasp or really show any emotion, but she just didn't. And Overton couldn't decide whether this was suspicious or if, this woman was just in shock. So after, laying out why he was here, he began just asking her questions to get a better read on her. So he asked her, when was the last time you saw your husband? And she just began to speak. She said it was the evening he had left for the train station. He was going to Belgium to collect the inheritance from a relative who had died recently. She said that she'd been staying home and taking care of their 3 kids since then and hadn't heard anything from him since he had left. To Overton, this explained why Hippolyta was found in Senlis, because Senlis was about halfway between Paris and Belgium, so clearly he was on his way to Belgium. However, as he was internalizing this new information, he was interrupted by a very loud gasp. And he looked at Alphonsine to see that she had sort of broken out of her muted state and was staring at him with really wide eyes, like something huge had just occurred to her. And she told him, maybe her husband had been on his way back with all the money he got from the inheritance. And she said, maybe he was killed by a robber. Now, Overton, he considered this, and a robbery did make sense to him. Hippolyta was very well dressed, and there hadn't been any money in any of his pockets. But this whole interview with his wife just felt really off. Alphonsine didn't seem at all confused or rattled or upset in any way. And now, just literally moments after finding out that potentially your husband has been brutally murdered, like he's dead, She's begun pitching theories of how he was killed, like she was trying to point the finger at someone else right away. It just felt off. Now, to Overton, Alphonsine did not really seem like she could have been the one to actually kill Ippolita herself. She's clearly here alone with 3 young kids, and, this took place in Senlis. And more than that is Ippolita was a pretty big guy, and he clearly had been overpowered by somebody or maybe multiple people. And, Alphonsine was. And so the officer and Overton, they get to the jail and they go inside. And when they reach the holding cell, Overton saw Etienne sitting inside. And he was wearing very shabby clothes and looked like he might be homeless. And so Overton, he goes inside the cell, and Etienne, he's just sitting there, he's not saying anything. And Overton, he just sits down and begins going over all the evidence that they had. And a lot of it made it seem like Etienne was their guy. And at some point, when Overton was done sort of going over what they had, he told Etienne that, "You're basically our only suspect at this point." So unless he could give Overton an alibi for the night of November 2nd, the night that Ippolita was killed, then unfortunately, Etienne was very likely going to be charged with murder. At this point, Etienne just sort of looked down for a moment and then let out this long, defeated sigh, like the reality of his situation was really settling in. Eventually, he looked back up at Overton and he mumbled that he did have an alibi. He said he had spent the whole night sleeping at an inn in Chantilly. He said the reason he hadn't told the police this is because he actually left the inn without paying. And that's also why he had run from the police when he was seen in the woods. He thought they were there to arrest him for theft. Overton looked hard at Etienne. He wasn't sure if he believed him, but he wrote down the name of the inn and planned to go out there and verify Etienne's alibi first thing in the morning. A week later, Judge Overton walked down a street in Paris, in the same working-class neighborhood where Ippolita and his family lived. He was on his way to check out a lead that he really hoped would reinvigorate his investigation, because over the last week, the case had completely stalled. Etienne's alibi had checked out. The inn's owner verified that Etienne had stayed there that night, and at some point he had left without paying. Now, this did not completely rule Etienne out, because he could have left his room without anyone noticing to go commit this murder, but it did make it seem much more likely that Etienne was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And since Etienne, Overton hadn't gotten any more tips about this case until that morning, when he'd gotten word that one of Ippolita's friends was missing. This friend was a Belgian farmer named Louis Baron, who had come to France to work with Ippolita. And this friend, Louis, hadn't been seen in over a week. Basically, since the murder, he's been missing. And so to Overton, the timing here was just too perfect to be a coincidence. And so now the judge was looking into Louis as a possible suspect who maybe skipped town after killing Ippolita. Overton came to a stop outside of the hotel where he had heard Louis was most recently living, which happened to be just a few blocks from Ippolita's apartment. The judge went inside and approached the front desk and asked the manager if a guest named Louis Baron had been around recently. And the manager said that yes, they definitely knew who Louis Baron was, but he hadn't been here in about a week. The manager said that the last time he had seen him, he was leaving the hotel on the night of November 2nd. And when he said that, Overton perked up, because that was the same night that Ippolita was killed. Like, again, the coincidence was just too much here. And so the judge quickly asked the manager, what else can you tell me about Louis? What kind of person was he? Who did he hang out with? Give me anything you got. And the manager clearly didn't know Louis particularly well, but he did say that there was one person he saw Louis with all the time. And often these two people were arguing in the lobby. Now, the manager said he didn't know who this person was, but this other person that Louis fought with appeared to be a middle-aged man with blonde hair. Now, to Overton, he's thinking, clearly, you're referencing Ippolita. That sounds like Ippolita, this guy. And so he asked the manager, did you ever overhear what these guys were fighting about? What were the arguments about? But the manager said he really didn't know. He said that, he couldn't ever hear what they were saying. It just always seemed like when they were talking, it was kind of heated. And he could really tell that Louis appeared to despise this other guy. It was much more Louis hating this guy than the other way around. The manager did tell Overton that occasionally their arguments did get so bad that it almost became violent. And in fact, the manager at one point or another had to break them up, physically separate them. But even still, he didn't know what they were fighting about. As Overton is hearing all this new information, his mind just raced. And as he looked around at this pretty shabby hotel in a rough part of town, he realized that the robbery theory might be partly right. But instead of it being some random thief, Ippolita might have been targeted by someone he knew, like Louis. And so if this blonde-haired guy that Louis was fighting with was Ippolita, then based on what the manager was saying, it seemed pretty reasonable to assume that Louis and Ippolita didn't get along. And if Louis was an out-of-work farmhand living in a shabby hotel, it wasn't unreasonable to think that he needed money desperately. And if Louis had known that Ippolita was traveling alone to go collect this inheritance, maybe he could have made plans to meet up with him on the way back and then lured him out to the woods and killed him and taken his money and then, after ditching his body on the tracks, fled to avoid being caught. And if Louis really did have all that inheritance money on him, with all that cash, he could be anywhere by now. And so Overton realized he might never find him. A couple of weeks later, in late November of 1888, Judge Overton sat in his office at the Senlis courthouse reading a telegram from a police sergeant in Belgium. Police all over France and Belgium had been searching for Louis Baron for weeks now, but this telegram was bad news just like all the others. This one said that no one in Louis's hometown had heard from him since before Ippolita's murder, and there was still no sign of him anywhere in Belgium. Overton sighed and began flipping through a stack of notes from the investigation. Louis was the strongest suspect because he'd completely skipped town on the same day Ippolita was killed. But he also hadn't ruled out Alphonsine. She'd acted incredibly suspicious when Overton spoke to her, and now Overton had discovered that she actually might have lied to him. He'd looked into the inheritance Ippolita had supposedly gone to collect in Belgium, and he couldn't corroborate any of the details that Alphonsine had given him. So the judge had looked into this inheritance that Ippolita had supposedly gone to Belgium to collect, and so far anyways, he hadn't been able to corroborate any of the details that Alphonsine had given him. Like, they hadn't found any record of this relative who supposedly died recently and was the one passing the inheritance to Ippolita and his family. Like, this person just didn't seem to exist. And then there was Etienne, who'd been found at the literal crime scene, covered in blood. But he'd had an alibi. And since this was 1888, DNA analysis didn't exist, so Overton had no way of proving that that blood was Ippolita's or his own or somebody else's. And so as Overton was racking his brain trying to figure out what he was missing, there was a knock on his door. And so Overton got up and he opened the door and he saw a man in a nice suit standing there. And the man asked if Overton had a few minutes to chat. He said it was about Ippolita's murder. Now, Overton didn't recognize him, so he was a little confused, but he needs some leads here. He needs progress on this case. So he said, yeah, come on in, let's chat. And so they sat down and this well-dressed man explained who he was. And then he launched into this incredibly wild story that at first didn't seem to have anything to do with the murder case. Then it was like all at once, Overton realized that what this man was saying was the key to his entire case. Based on all the evidence, which included letters and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Ippolita Hoyos on the night of November 2nd, 1888. Once it was totally dark out, the killer walked down a quiet, deserted road in the forest between Chantilly and Senlis, and as they walked along, they were absolutely buzzing with anticipation. The plan they'd been working on for weeks was about to be completed, and their victim had no idea what was coming. Up ahead, there was this bridge, this narrow bridge that went over some railroad tracks, and on the bridge was a man in a three-piece suit, and he was the target. The killer knew this man was worth a fortune to them, and so all they had to do now was just kill him, and they, the killer, would be set for life. And so carefully, trying not to make a sound, the killer began hustling toward the bridge, and as they did, they reached into their jacket and they pulled out a hatchet. And so finally they got to the bridge and they crept up right behind their victim, and without the man even noticing, the killer raised the hatchet and brought it down on the back of this guy's head. And then after that, they hit him over and over again with the hatchet until the man stopped moving. After that, the killer put away their hatchet and then lifted this man's body up and dumped it over the railing, and it fell down below. And then the killer, they walked off the bridge and turned around and went down the hill down to those railroad tracks, and they grabbed the body of their victim and dragged it and placed the body on the tracks. They were hoping that by doing this, it would look like, this guy was hit by a train, not murdered. But before the killer could actually flee the scene, they first had to do one more thing, just to make sure they wouldn't get caught. And so they reached into their own pocket and they pulled out two items, a handkerchief and a piece of paper with an address on it, and they stuffed both of these items in the jacket pocket of their victim, and then the killer fled. The victim was not Hipólito Hoyos. He was the killer. But turn out the body that the investigators thought belonged to Hipólita was actually Hipólita's own friend, Louis Barone. So Hipólita and his wife Alphonsine, they conspired to murder Louis and make it appear like his body was actually Hipólita's body. Because just a few months before the murder, Hipólita had taken out a life insurance claim on himself that in the event of his death, Alphonsine would be paid a huge sum of money. But Hipólita had no intention of dying. They needed somebody else to die on his behalf. And it just so happened that Louis actually already looked an awful lot like Hipólita, like strikingly similar. And so Hipólita lured Louis out to that deserted stretch of road in the woods on the way to a job interview, which was just pretext to lure his friend out there to be isolated. And there, Hipólita butchers his friend with the hatchet, kills him, and after hitting him over the head a bunch of times on the bridge, he flipped him over and hacked his face apart with the hatchet as well, just to ensure his face would be so badly mauled, nobody could recognize him. Hipólita also put that handkerchief and that note with the address in his pockets, which, by the way, he's literally wearing one of Hipólita's suits that he so, kindly allowed his friend to use for the job interview. It was a setup. He put those items inside of the suit and he's like, boom, now the police are going to find this body. They're going to think it's me. Here's all this evidence that will suggest it's me, and I'm going to get off scot-free. But Hipólita and his wife Alphonsine had left one big loose end. And that loose end was the well-dressed man who had walked into Judge Oberton's office and basically cracked the case wide open. The well-dressed man at Oberton's door was the president of an insurance company. And he told the judge that Hipólita had been shopping around for a life insurance policy just 2 months before his sudden murder, and that his insurance company had actually flagged Hipólita's application as possible fraud. And so they had not given him the policy. But he would tell Oberton that apparently after this failed attempt, Hipólita just reached out to another insurer who did take the bait. And as soon as that contract was signed and suddenly Hipólita had this policy, Hipólita supposedly died. And so after hearing these details from the president of this company, Oberton ordered the body to be exhumed and re-examined. And this time, when the body was compared against photos, investigators confirmed it was in fact Louis. The real Hipólita was tracked down in the north of France, where he was living under Louis' identity.
In reality, she was an undercover cop, and her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Etta, win her trust, and see if maybe then Etta would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Etta. And at this point, Etta was woken up by the noise and she sat up on her bench and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop, she was immediately struck by Etta's appearance. Etta did not look like a murderer. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Etta was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She is effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it, and she's just laying down sleeping in her cell, making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down, and at some point she asked Etta, hey, what are you in here for? And Etta, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second. And then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never going to believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Etta would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character. Because Etta, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's hearing this, but in her mind, she's like, okay, well, I clearly just discovered Etta's motive for being involved in this murder. Etta wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Etta and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Etta talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust because Etta had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now here Etta was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Etta, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Etta played a role in her murder. His theory went like this. 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police were called and a search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Etta just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so the detective who was talking to Etta at the time when she came in and said this, he brought out a map and he said, okay, point to where she is. And Etta had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Etta, how do you know this? Etta would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, Etta, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me you know where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me? And Etta would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Etta when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Etta because she looked so unthreatening, and what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Etta was, he discovered that she had a great job. She worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Etta would have this information, the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Etta was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Etta, hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter, we'll fly out over that canyon, and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together. And so Etta said, okay, sounds good. She turned and she left. But then just an hour later, Etta came back into the police station with her 2 young kids in the car, and she would tell that detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, 1, had gone out by herself to do this, but 2, had brought along her kids as well? Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Etta's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon, and sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Etta said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Etta and said, "You're under arrest. I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved." The captain thought by putting Etta in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Etta had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story that was kind of still developing would likely be turned into a movie. And so the captain really didn't know what to do because at this point, Etta had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police. And there was no evidence that actually tied Etta to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Etta came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that fourth day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Etta would go into the police station to report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was, well, on that day, Etta was at work listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Etta listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really was no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Etta's listening to the news about Melanie that Etta heard a voice in the room she was in. And the voice said very clearly to Etta, "She's not in one of those houses." And Etta immediately, when she heard it, she turned around wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her, but there was nobody else in the room. And then it was like immediately there were these flashes of images in Etta's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road and then a bush and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Etta very clearly saw these three images. And it was right then that Etta thought, oh my God, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car and she drove to the police station and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Etta just couldn't wait, and so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind, and sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen, then she found the bush that she had seen, and then with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe, and it was right near Melanie's body. Which meant that voice that Etta heard and the vision she had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the fourth day that Etta was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop, the phone call that changed the whole case, well, the phone call was from another police officer saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed and they were now being held in jail. And so clearly, Etta did not commit this murder, and so even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Etta the same day, so she was released, and then ultimately the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty, and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta would sue the police department, and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Etta really did have a psychic vision that led to the discovery of Melanie's body. Etta would never go on to make a movie about her story, and in fact, when she was asked later on about why she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Etta would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm living out a bad movie. And so that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened. On the night of November 7th, 1860, a 51-year-old American politician walked inside of his modest 2-story home in Springfield, Illinois. This politician was totally exhausted, but he was also really happy because in his hand he had a telegram that confirmed he had won an election that he had worked so hard for and he wasn't sure he was going to get. And so earlier that night, this politician had been out basically partying and celebrating this huge victory, but now he was totally beat and ready for bed. Once the politician was inside his house, he picked up an oil lamp to light the way, and he walked through his house to his study, where he put the lamp down on his desk. He put the telegram saying he had won this election next to the lamp, and then the politician just collapsed into his sofa to fall asleep. But before he closed his eyes, this politician looked over at a mirror on the wall, and what he saw in the mirror made him gasp, and he sat upright and looked at it like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In this mirror, this politician was seeing his own face, reflected as it should be, but then next to it was another face, and it was not his. It kind of looked like him, but it actually looked more like a corpse, like a dead person was looking out at him from this mirror. And so the politician, he stood up and began walking over to the mirror to get a closer look, but as he got closer, the dead person's face disappeared, and all was left was his own reflection. And so he's like, okay, I must have been dreaming that, that can't have been real. And so feeling very unsettled, this politician just went back over to the couch and he laid back down thinking, okay, just forget about that, go to sleep. But again, he glanced over at the mirror, and now that he was laying down again, he saw the two faces again, his own and this dead person's face. And at this point, he stood up and rushed out of the room into his bedroom where his wife was. Now, his wife was a very devoted spiritualist, and so the politician thought maybe he could tell her about what he saw in the mirror, and she could interpret it and tell him what it meant. And so he sat down and he told his wife about what he had just seen, and she would sit there for a minute pondering what her husband had just said, and then her expression on her face just totally changed. She went from intrigued to very upset, and in a quivering voice, she would tell her husband that what this meant was he would serve honorably in the office that he had just been elected to for one term, he would get reelected, but he would not survive the second term. Now, when the politician heard this, he immediately rejected it. And he said to his wife, there's no way that's true. I probably didn't even see a face in the mirror. I'm probably just so tired, I imagined what I saw. So let's just forget about it. But his wife was not consoled, and she fell into his arms sobbing as if he had just been diagnosed with some fatal illness. And over the next several days and weeks and months, this politician's wife continued to be so upset about this potential death omen that the politician had apparently had, even though, again, the politician is constantly telling his wife, come on, there's no way that's actually going to happen. And sure enough, over time, the politician's wife did sort of stop being so scared all the time that her husband was going to die, and the politician himself, he just kind of forgot about what he had seen in the mirror that night. And so he would go on to serve his first term in this elected office. He would be reelected for a second term. And then during his second term, on April 14th, 1865, this politician and his wife were out at a play in Washington, D.C., and during the last act of the play, a man named John Wilkes Booth famously snuck up behind Abraham Lincoln, who was this elected politician. He was the president of the United States. In his second term, he would get reelected, but he would not survive the second term. Now, when the politician heard this, he immediately rejected it. And he said to his wife, there's no way that's true. I probably didn't even see a face in the mirror. I'm probably just so tired, I imagined what I saw. So let's just forget about it. But his wife was not consoled, and she fell into his arms sobbing as if he had just been diagnosed with some fatal illness. And over the next several days and weeks and months, this politician's wife continued to be so upset about this potential death omen that the politician had apparently had, even though, again, the politician is constantly telling his wife, come on, there's no way that's actually going to happen. And sure enough, over time, the politician's wife did sort of stop being so scared all the time that her husband was going to die, and the politician himself, he just kind of forgot about what he had seen in the mirror that night. And so he would go on to serve his first term in this elected office. He would be reelected for a second term. And then during his second term, on April 14th, 1865, this politician and his wife were out at a play in Washington, D.C., and during the last act of the play, a man named John Wilkes Booth famously snuck up behind Abraham Lincoln, who was this elected politician. He was the president of the United States in his second term, and John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, killing him. And so Abraham Lincoln would indeed not survive his second term, just like the mirror death omen had predicted. On April 1st, 1984, a 28-year-old man named James Sevigny opened his eyes and looked down and saw his whole body was covered in snow, and a lot of that snow had turned red from what looked like blood. James tried to take a breath in, but as soon as he did, his chest exploded in pain. Then James began moving his tongue around in his mouth, and he realized there was this weird substance in his mouth, and there were all these sharp objects in his mouth. And so when he spit, he realized what it was. It was blood and shattered teeth. James began to panic and tried to lift up one of his arms, but it wouldn't move. And then when he tried to move his other arm, it did move, but that little movement hurt so bad he began crying in pain. So James is dealing with this blinding full body pain that he has no idea what it came from. He's looking around and he can barely understand where he is or what happened. But then James looked up kind of right behind him and he saw this enormous snow-covered mountain. Now, James had no idea what mountain this was, but in his head, he thought, I must have attempted to climb that mountain. James was a self-described climbing bum, which really just meant he lived out of his car most of the time and traveled all around the world, seeking out the most dangerous mountains in the world for him to climb. And so as James was racking his brain, trying to remember what happened, suddenly it all just came flooding back. He remembered he was here in the Canadian Rockies with his best friend, Richard Whitmore, and the two of them had attempted to climb this particular mountain. It was an 11,000 foot tall mountain called Mount Deltaform. And James remembered that as they were making their way up this mountain, they were hit by an avalanche. Now, James didn't really remember what happened once the avalanche hit them, but it would turn out he had fallen, along with his friend Richard, about 140 stories as this avalanche carried them down the mountain. For reference, that's taller than the Empire State Building, so this is a massive fall. And so as James is remembering that avalanche, he began looking around frantically for his friend Richard, hoping that maybe he was okay and nearby, and they could work together to get out of this situation. And sure enough, at some point, James looked over and he saw there was a crumpled figure kind of lying in the snow that obviously was another person. And so James instinctively tried to sit up to go over to his friend, but as soon as he attempted to do that, he felt the blinding pain in his body. I mean, he is totally wrecked here, and he couldn't stand up. But James really wanted to go see his friend, so he kind of rolled over, and through the pain, using his one good arm, he crawled his way over to Richard. And for a second, he thought maybe his friend was alive, that he too had survived this epic fall. But as he looked down at Richard, he could see his chest was not moving, and his neck was twisted really badly, and so was his back. And so James knew his friend Richard was dead. And so James just collapsed into the snow, feeling unbelievable anguish and sadness and fear. I mean, this is the only other person out here. They are nowhere near civilization, and it's going to be at least 4 days before anybody even notices that they aren't back yet, because that was when James and Richard were supposed to be home. And now James is thinking, I can't even stand up. I can barely breathe. I'm so badly hurt. What am I going to do? And pretty quickly, James adopted the mindset of, unfortunately, you're going to die here. And this was something James had always thought would happen to him eventually, that a mountain would end up killing him. And here he was realizing that, yep, that's exactly what's about to happen. I'm going to die out here. And so James just kind of lay there, resigned to his fate, literally waiting to die. And after about 20 minutes, when his body began to go numb and he was starting to enter into hypothermia, James heard a voice from behind him. It was this woman who walked right up to him, and she said, "You can't give up. You have to try." And James, even though he was totally caught off guard that there was another person out here, there was something so calming about this woman and the way she was talking to him that without any hesitation, it was like James's whole mindset about this situation completely changed. Suddenly, he was not ready to give up and die. But now, because of this woman, he was going to fight to survive. And so, after kind of moving around and looking back towards this woman, she would say to him, "Put your coat on." And so James, despite the excruciating pain, used his one arm that still worked and kind of propped himself up. And then he pulled his coat out of his pack, which was lying near him. And very painfully, he slipped this coat over his broken and damaged arms. And then once the coat was on him, the woman said to James, "Now take a sip of water." And so James, without any hesitation, he reached over and grabbed his water. He unscrewed the top and took a sip, despite how painful it was to sip, even though the water stung his totally shattered mouth. And then after James put the water down, the woman very calmly told him, "Okay, now disconnect yourself from Richard's body and then use the tree right here to pull yourself up." And so he untied from Richard, and then using his one good arm, he grabbed the tree and he managed to hoist himself up onto his totally destroyed legs. And he couldn't believe he was even standing at this point, but here he was, up on his feet. And then the woman said, okay, it's time to move. And so James began walking away from the mountain, and this woman just followed along behind him. And for a long time, he trudged through this knee-high snow, barely able to take a step without this blinding pain coursing through his body. But every time he began to stumble or slow down or seemed like he was going to give up, the woman would very calmly urge him to keep going, keep moving. And finally, after about 4 hours of this horribly painful trek James was on, he came upon the camp that he and his friend Richard had built before coming over to this mountain to begin this climb. And so James quickly began moving towards his tent that was still pitched, that he knew inside had a warm sleeping bag and some water and food. And so as he made his way towards the tent, he stopped himself and he turned around to talk to his guide, to thank her for pushing him onward. But when he turned, there was no one there. And when he looked at the ground, there was only one set of bloody footprints that were his, leading all the way back to where he had fallen. This guide, this woman, she didn't exist. James was totally unsettled by this and really didn't know what to do about it, but he knew right now the priority was just to survive. And so he made his way over to his tent and he attempted to get inside of it, but his hands were so cold and so badly beaten up that he couldn't use the zipper. He couldn't even get it open. And then finally, when he managed to use a tool to get it open, he couldn't open up his sleeping bag. It was like his body was shutting down. And so we thought, okay, I'll make a fire and that will be enough to keep me warm. But again, it's like his body was failing him and he couldn't do it. He couldn't start the fire. And so right as James is realizing that, despite making it to this campsite, he may not be able to survive because he can't use the campsite, he began to hear voices. Right away, James is worried that the voices he's hearing don't really exist, like this woman he had seen. But sure enough, just a second later, 3 skiers came around the corner and they saw James. And amazingly, one of them was a very experienced mountain guide, and another one of them was a nurse. And so right away, when they saw James, they saw he was dying. The nurse rushed over, she made a fire for him, she got him comfortable, she put on warm clothes, and the mountain guide, he took off to go get help. And sure enough, a couple hours later, a helicopter arrived and they airlifted James out, and he would make a full recovery. However, it would take James years before he finally opened up about this mysterious vanishing woman who literally saved his life. Without her talking to him and urging him to go, he would have laid there next to his friend and died. But James, he was afraid to bring up that he had seen this woman in fear that people would think he was crazy. But when he finally brought it up, he would quickly learn that he was far from the first person to experience this phenomenon of having this invisible person help you. In fact, this phenomenon is common enough that it has its own name. It's called the third man effect. The third man refers to this mysterious vanishing person that steps in and helps people survive who have just undergone some horribly traumatic event. An example of somebody else who has experienced the third man effect was the very last person to escape the Second World Trade Center tower on September 11th, 2001 in New York City during the terrorist attacks. He was able to get out right before it collapsed because a mysterious vanishing voice told him exactly which direction to go until he escaped. And so whether the third man effect is actually supernatural or just a trick of survivor psychology, we don't know. James, who is both an atheist and a scientist, says he does not believe that this woman who saved him was an angel or connected to religion in any way. Instead, he just said, it was a presence that I needed at the time that saved my life, but that is the extent of my understanding.
5:30 a.m. on November 13th, 1989, 16-year-old Amy Widener woke up coughing in her upstairs bedroom in Indianapolis, Indiana. Amy's throat burned. She glanced over at the clock on her bedside table and saw how early it still was. Now, normally she would have slept a bit longer before getting up and getting ready for school, but she just kept on coughing, so she knew she was not going to be able to fall back asleep. And she knew she needed to stay home sick today. Amy heard a knock on her bedroom door, and her mother, Gloria, walked inside, holding a 2-year-old little girl in her arms. Her mother said she'd heard Amy coughing, and she wanted to check on her. But Amy barely even heard what her mother was saying. Instead, she was smiling at the little girl. In a big, animated voice, Amy said, "Good morning," and the little girl smiled back, reached out her arms, and said, "Mamie."
which was her name for Amy. This little 2-year-old girl was Amy's daughter. The girl's father was a friend of Amy's who was a couple years older than her, but he had never really played a role in the baby's life. When Amy's daughter was born, Amy had loved her immediately, but she had also been terrified. She had no idea how she was going to raise a child on her own, and she thought her life as a normal teenager was basically over. But Amy's mother, Gloria, had done everything in her power to make sure that didn't happen. Gloria had played a huge part in raising this little girl. In fact, Amy's daughter often called Gloria Mom. And Gloria's help, along with the help from some of Amy's teachers, had allowed Amy to not only stay in high school, but to thrive. Amy got good grades, she was a cheerleader, she played clarinet in the high school band, and she even tutored other students in French, a language she absolutely loved. She had dreams of going to college someday, and most people who knew her just assumed she would grow up to be a really cool French teacher someday. Back in the bedroom, Amy told her mother there was just no way she could go to school today with her cough. Her mother agreed, never really played a role in the baby's life. When Amy's daughter was born, Amy had loved her immediately, but she had also been terrified. She had no idea how she was going to raise a child on her own, and she thought her life as a normal teenager was basically over. But Amy's mother, Gloria, had done everything in her power to make sure that didn't happen. Gloria had played a huge part in raising this little girl. In fact, Amy's daughter often called Gloria Mom. And Gloria's help, along with the help from some of Amy's teachers, had allowed Amy to not only stay in high school, but to thrive. Amy got good grades, she was a cheerleader, she played clarinet in the high school band, and she even tutored other students in French, a language she absolutely loved. She had dreams of going to college someday, and most people who knew her just assumed she would grow up to be a really cool French teacher someday. Back in the bedroom, Amy told her mother there was just no way she could go to school today with her cough. Her mother agreed and told her that she could still take her baby to the babysitter like she usually did during the week, but Amy said to leave her at home. It'd be nice to spend the day with her little girl. Gloria said okay, and then put the little girl on the bed next to Amy, and then she walked out to get ready for work. As tired and sick as Amy felt, she couldn't stop smiling. She loved that her mother had made it possible for her to still just be a teenager most of the time. However, she missed her daughter a lot when she was at school. And so a day like today, to be alone with her daughter was really special. While Amy sat and talked to her daughter on the bed, her older brother, JP, walked in. The siblings were only a year apart, and they were extremely close. They drove to school together every day and ran in the same circle of friends. And this close-knit group of high schoolers spent almost all of their free time together. JP told his sister to get well and said he'd see her when he got home from school. The house remained loud and full of energy for the next couple of hours while Amy's mom got ready for work and her brother and 2 younger sisters got ready for school. But eventually, everybody cleared out and the house became quiet. Amy continued to sit on her bed and just play with her daughter. In a house with 4 school-age kids and a baby, silence was very rare, so this morning felt extra special. However, that feeling quickly disappeared when Amy heard a door open downstairs. She figured one of her younger sisters must have just forgotten their backpack or something. So Amy cleared her throat and coughed a little, and then called out to see who would come home. A little before noon, a few hours after Amy and the baby had been left alone, Amy's mother, Gloria, pulled her car up to the front of the house. She had called Amy several times from work, but she hadn't gotten an answer. She worried that since Amy was sick, she might have fallen asleep, and she just wanted to make sure Amy and the baby were okay. Gloria got out of her car, rushed up the walkway, unlocked the front door, and walked inside. She called out for Amy, but she didn't hear anything. Then, as she walked through the front room and reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. Amy's little girl was sitting on the landing at the top of the stairs all by herself, and she was crying. And she had blood on her pajamas. Gloria instantly ran up the stairs and picked up the baby and held on to her tight, and then she ran through the upstairs hallway and called out for her daughter again, but still didn't get any answer. Gloria reached Amy's bedroom and opened the door. She looked over at the bed and immediately began to scream. That afternoon, not long after Gloria had gotten home, Detective Norman Matthews of the Indianapolis Police Department parked in front of Amy's house and stepped outside. Police had already taped off the property, and Detective Matthews saw forensics officers scouring the front yard for evidence. Matthews also saw a woman standing with several uniformed police officers. The woman was crying, but at the same time, she was gently bouncing a little girl in her arms, doing everything she could to make sure the girl wasn't scared or upset. Matthews put on gloves, ducked under the crime scene tape, and walked into the house through the front door. More forensics officers were busy searching both floors of the house, and one of them pointed Matthews upstairs. Matthews walked up the steps, went down the hall, and into Amy's bedroom. A camera flashed as a forensic photographer took pictures of the scene in the bedroom, while Matthews just stood there inside the doorway, staring at the bed. There, he saw Amy Widener's lifeless body. Her face and her red hair were bloody, she was naked, and there was blood all over the sheets and on the wall above her. Matthews stepped closer to the body, and he could see cuts and a deep gash on Amy's forehead, and there was bruising on her throat, arms, and legs. The attack on this young woman looked vicious and uncontrolled, which was horrific enough in and of itself. But when Detective Matthews had gotten the call to come to this house, he'd been informed that this attack had taken place while the victim's 2-year-old daughter was present, and that information made this crime scene much, much worse. Detective Matthews met with the forensics officer who was working in the bedroom. The officer told him that amidst the blood on the wall, they had found what looked like a pretty clear palm print. The officer said the forensics team would carve out that section of the wall to make sure the print was preserved in its entirety, in hopes they could eventually find a match in their databases. For reference, in 1989, DNA testing was still very much in its early stages, and so it was not being used as an investigative tool by the Indianapolis Police Department. Matthews stepped out of Amy's bedroom, and along with several other police officers, started a full search of the house. The front door had apparently been locked when Gloria had come home to check on Amy and the baby, and there was no sign of forced entry. But Matthews and his team found that the sliding glass door on the back patio was unlocked. He also found that Amy's brother's bedroom looked like it had been ransacked. The dresser drawers were open, and it appeared that some pieces of stereo equipment had been pulled out of the wall and stolen. And so on the surface, this murder now looked like it could have been the result of a burglary gone wrong. Maybe someone had shown up to rob the place and heard Amy or the baby upstairs, and then just attacked and killed Amy like a target of opportunity. But as Matthews and his team combed through the rest of the house, something hit him. No other rooms looked like Amy's brother's room. There were no signs of robbery anywhere else. If this was a robbery gone wrong, Matthews figured that whoever did it must have been familiar with the house. They must have known exactly where that stereo equipment was and had come there specifically to get it. Matthews knew he did have a witness that might be able to identify the intruder, especially if the intruder was someone who had been to the house before. But there was a big problem with this, because that witness was just 2 years old. After Matthews and his team had completed their initial search of the house, he met with Amy's mother, Gloria, outside. Gloria was able to confirm that stereo equipment was missing from her son's room. She also said JP usually kept about $50 in cash in a dresser drawer, but that was gone too. Matthews told Gloria that this information was extremely helpful, but there was something more important that he needed from her. He needed her permission for police to question her granddaughter. The idea of putting her granddaughter through any more stress after what that little girl had been through that day made Gloria feel very uneasy. But her daughter had just been brutally murdered, and so she needed the killer to be found and brought to justice. So she agreed to Matthew's request. Gloria and Amy's 2-year-old daughter took a seat on the front porch, along with Detective Matthews and a police officer who specialized in working with young kids. And that officer introduced herself to Amy's little girl and then handed her some finger puppets. And then she asked the little girl to use these finger puppets to tell everybody what had happened that morning. And then that officer and the others watched and listened as the little girl used the finger puppets to act out a scene. She made it look like two of the puppets were fighting for a little while, and then she said later on, Mamie was laying on the bed. The little girl had said she had tried to lift Mamie up, but then said Mamie was just too heavy. When Gloria heard her granddaughter say this, she just broke down, and Matthews and the other officer tried not to show how much this affected them. The fact that this little girl had clearly seen her mother get murdered was not something they could just shake off. Eventually, the officer who specialized in working with young kids asked the little girl one more question. Did she know the person who had come into Mamie's room? But all the little girl could remember was that the person was Strong. Detective Matthews told the little girl what a great job she'd done, and then he asked Gloria if he could speak to her alone for a minute. Gloria told her granddaughter to stay with the police officer and she'd be right back. Then she followed Matthews off the porch. Matthews told her that the fact her son's room was the only room that had been robbed led him to believe that the killer was very likely another young person who her kids knew. And very likely they knew in advance that the stereo equipment and the $50 would be in JP's room. So Matthews asked Gloria to come up with a list of names of people who were closest to Amy and JP. Gloria said that Amy and her brother JP hung out with a small group of friends, but she said there was someone outside that group that Matthews should definitely talk to before anybody else. The father of Amy's child, a young man named Tony Abercrombie. And sure enough, the day after the murder, Detective Matthews brought Tony into the station for an interview. Tony was 18 years old, tall with long wavy brown hair, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He looked to Matthews like almost every other teenager in the area. The night before, Matthews had seen Tony giving an impromptu interview about Amy's murder on a local news show, and Matthews didn't really know what to think about that. The reporter had most likely shown up at Tony's house unannounced, and it could be difficult for a young man like Tony to tell a reporter to leave him alone, but there was also the possibility that Tony craved the attention. There were plenty of homicide cases throughout history where the killer went out of their way to get their name in the news. However, Matthews was not ready to jump to any conclusions like that. And now, looking at Tony across the table, he could tell this kid seemed very upset and maybe even a bit scared. Matthews told Tony he was not in any kind of trouble. The police just needed to know some things about his relationship with Amy. Tony nodded and told Matthews he'd been good friends with Amy's brother JP. That's how he had met Amy. He said they'd gone out a few times and then ended up sleeping together, and Amy got pregnant. Tony admitted that the idea of becoming a father at his age scared him, and he was not looking forward to the birth of the baby. However, when the baby was born, Amy and Gloria had basically raised her without him. So Tony said he hadn't talked much to Amy since then or had anything to do with his child. He told Matthews he'd gotten a phone call from Amy's friend that Amy had been killed on the morning it happened. Tony said he'd felt completely torn up when she had told him, and in fact, he had to leave work because he was so upset. Tony said he might not have seen Amy very much lately, but he still cared about her. And on top of that, she was one of the sweetest people he'd ever met. It didn't make sense that somebody would want to hurt her. Shortly after that, Matthews got Tony's work details and then told him police would follow up if they needed more information. And then he let him go. Matthews needed to see if Tony really had been at work on the morning Amy had been killed. But based on this one interview he had just done, Tony did not seem like the type of person who had done that TV interview to draw attention to himself. Instead, he just seemed like a kid who was very upset that a girl he'd been with and fathered a child with was now gone. In the days immediately following the child with was now gone. In the days immediately following the murder, the investigative team started to look into a range of Amy's friends and classmates, believing the person who broke in and killed her was most likely someone Amy knew. But, based on what he'd seen at Amy's house, Detective Matthews had also developed a new theory. Maybe there hadn't been a break-in at all. Maybe Amy's brother JP had killed her and then ransacked his own room to try to throw off the police. So, Detective Matthews met with JP multiple times. And in every meeting, JP made it very clear how angry and upset he was that police would even think he could do something like this to his sister. He said he loved Amy, maybe more than anybody else in the whole world. They had been so close ever since they were little kids. But despite these multiple interviews and Detective Matthews' continued interest in JP, the detective did not find anything linking him directly to the crime. His fingerprints were all over the house, including inside of Amy's room, but that was expected. He lived there, so it really didn't mean anything. And there was nothing JP did in the aftermath of the murder that added more suspicion to him. In fact, JP just seemed devastated by the loss of his sister. And then on November 17th, so 4 days after Amy's murder, when Amy's friends and family all gathered together for her funeral, JP shared countless stories about some of the best times he'd spent with his sister. He said because they were so close in age, it was like they weren't just siblings, they were more like really good friends. At the funeral, JP, along with JP and Amy's mutual friend Rodney, and some of Amy's girlfriends, did their best to try to console Amy's younger siblings and her mother Gloria. But it felt like an impossible task, because none of them could accept that this had really happened. Following the funeral, Detective Matthews and his team collected the guest book and made a note of everybody at the service who'd signed the book. Many of the guests had been Amy's classmates and her teachers. And so Matthews and his team first met with some of the high school students on the list that they had not already spoken to. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. All of them just sort of ended with the students talking about how much they were going to miss their friend. And at the same time, Matthews still didn't have any real concrete evidence, like any information on the bloody palm print that had been found in Amy's room. So one afternoon, in the week following the murder, Matthews walked down a long hallway lined with lockers at Amy's high school. School was already out, so there were only a handful of students who were still there. Matthews turned down a different hallway with classroom doors on either side and found the French classroom. He walked in and saw Amy's French teacher, Jody George, waiting for him. Matthews had heard from several people that Jody was Amy's favorite teacher, and so he told Jody this, and this immediately made Jody break down into tears. She told the detective that Amy had always been a great student, but the real reason that she and Amy had connected was actually because they both had been raising babies at the same time. Jody's child was born not too long after Amy's daughter had been born, and so Amy and the teacher shared parenting tips with each other and bonded over being new mothers. Matthew's hope was that in meeting with Jody, that perhaps she could point him towards other students who were maybe Amy's friends, but who didn't attend the funeral. Detective Matthews ended up getting a list of students that Amy had tutored in French, and he asked Jody if any of these kids might have had a problem with Amy. But Jody said no, not that she knew of. And then over the next several days, as Matthews went down this new list of students, it didn't really go anywhere. Because once again, all these students could say was just that they really liked Amy, and they couldn't believe she was gone. By the end of November, about 2 weeks after the murder, Matthews felt like he had spoken to every high school kid in town, and he still wasn't any closer to finding Amy's killer. Tony Abercrombie, the father of Amy's daughter, looked like he had a solid alibi, as did her brother JP, who was seen in class by multiple people at the time his sister was killed. And when Matthews finally got the results on that bloody palm print that had been on the wall in Amy's room, it didn't match Tony or JP's prints. It also did not match any of Amy's friends that police had interviewed, or any prints in any criminal database. So Matthews felt like he basically had nothing, and now he wondered if he'd just been plain wrong the whole time. Maybe Amy didn't know her killer, and it was just some random stranger that had broken into the house and killed her. And if that was the case, it meant the suspect pool could basically include almost anyone. Matthews and his team continued to follow any potential leads, and they returned to the crime scene to see if there was anything they might have missed. But as 1990 began, and several more months passed, it became clear the police had no real suspects. Amy's family still got together with Amy's friends and that French teacher Jody to share stories and keep Amy's memory alive, but most of them came to believe that her murder would never be solved. And as even more time went by with no new leads, some members of the investigative team started to feel the same way. And eventually, Detective Matthews and the rest of the investigative team had to focus on new cases. And so Amy's murder case went cold. and it would stay that way for a long, long time. Fast forward to 2002, so 13 years after Amy's murder. Detective Roger Spurgeon, the lead cold case detective at the Indianapolis Police Department, got a call at his desk. And when he answered, he heard a man's voice, and this man sounded totally afraid. The man told the detective that the previous night he'd had these horrible dreams about the murder of Amy Widener that had taken place back in 1989. The man said he worked at the school where Amy had gone, so he had known her, but not very well. But now he was having these visceral dreams about her death. And so he felt like he just needed to pass on what he was seeing in these dreams, because he believed maybe it could help police solve the murder, which in turn could make these terrible dreams go away. Detective Spurgeon just sat at his desk, stunned by what he was hearing. Getting bizarre phone calls about old homicide cases was not totally unheard of. Usually they didn't lead to anything. But this man sounded genuinely upset. And so, operating on a hunch, Spurgeon took down notes on these dreams the caller was having. And after the call was over, Spurgeon pulled Amy's case file. The caller's supposed dreams did give a lot of details about Amy's murder. But for the most part, these details had all been covered in the press at the time of Amy's death, or in the years following. Spurgeon figured this caller was not the most dependable source, but he couldn't just let this go. After all, this man could have details about the murder, not because he was dreaming it, but because he was involved. And so the detective dug into this man's background, and he discovered that he did in fact work at Amy's high school, like he had said. So Spurgeon went to the school and met with several teachers and administrators who knew the caller, and many of them had actually worked at the school when Amy was killed as well. Now, during these initial few conversations, nothing really stood out to Spurgeon, but then the school's guidance counselor told Spurgeon something that was really strange. They told him that they knew who the man was who claimed to have these dreams about Amy, and they said this man could not have killed her, because on the morning of Amy's murder, that man, the caller, had been working at the school. And the guidance counselor said on the day of the murder, this person, this man, kind of out of nowhere, had this violent episode where he just started screaming and kicking things. In fact, his episode had gotten so bad that eventually the counselor had to help the man out of the school and drive him home. This was definitely a new one for Detective Spurgeon. He'd gotten some strange calls before, but this man's dreams and now his episode on the morning of the murder were something else. Spurgeon followed up with the man who had called him about his dreams, and he even re-interviewed several people who'd been connected to the initial murder case. But just like during the initial investigation, nothing came out of these interviews. After several months of looking into the case again, the detective had nothing new. And so Amy's killer remained unknown and free. And soon her case went cold again. And it would stay that way for almost another decade. On a morning in 2011, so 22 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Bill Carter, a nuisance and abatement officer with the Indianapolis Police, sat in a small office scrolling through Facebook. A nuisance and abatement officer is a cop who works directly with the fire inspector to check on venues like restaurants and clubs that might be breaking fire code. And so Sergeant Carter spent a lot of his time looking at Facebook to see if any events or big parties were being talked about that would potentially violate fire code laws. Just then, Carter heard a knock on his door. He said to come on in, and he looked up to see a homicide detective standing there. This was definitely weird, because Carter had very little interaction with the homicide department. The homicide detective said he was heading up cold cases now, and recently he'd found a Facebook page dedicated to the victim of one of the coldest cases they had, the Amy Widener murder from 1989. Carter said he knew about the case. It had been in the news off and on over the years since it happened, and he'd also grown up in the same part of town as Amy. But none of this explained why a homicide detective would be coming to see him about this case. The homicide detective said he wanted to print off everything from this Facebook page dedicated to Amy to add it to the case files, and to cross-check some of the people on the page with people mentioned in the original investigation. The problem was that he and the other homicide detectives didn't know how to print things off of Facebook, so he was hoping Carter could help them. Carter stifled a laugh and said he'd take care of it. The homicide detective walked off, and then Carter quickly found the Facebook page called Remembering Amy Widener. Even though Carter was familiar with the case, seeing photos of Amy as a happy teenager really hit him. And as he read through the comments on the page, he saw how many people were still deeply affected by this murder. It just seemed so wrong that her friends and family had gone this long without any kind of closure. And so Carter printed out everything from the Facebook page for the homicide detective, but before he did, he sort of read through it all. And as he did, he started to feel like he really needed to do something to help. Over the next several weeks, in his free time, Sergeant Carter started to look through the old case files for Amy's murder. Now, normally, homicide detectives would not have wanted an officer from another department anywhere near their files, especially an officer who only dealt with fire codes. But Amy's case had remained unsolved for so long that they figured whatever Carter was doing couldn't hurt. Sergeant Carter regularly checked the Facebook page dedicated to Amy, made notes on the pages he'd printed, and tried to see if he could connect anything to something in the original case files. He even reached out to several of Amy's friends and family members who'd been interviewed in the past to see if they had any new information to offer. For months, Carter's efforts weren't much different from the detectives who'd worked the case in the past. No new leads, no new evidence. Carter stuck with it, continuing to work Amy's case whenever he had the time. And on a day in June of 2012, now closing in on 23 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Carter caught something in the case files that seemed to have gone overlooked for decades. At first, Carter thought he had to be wrong. Maybe he'd been spending so much time with the case looking at countless pieces of paper and file folders that he'd just gotten confused, or he was delirious or something. But when he looked at what he'd found in the case file again, and checked it with the Facebook page and the notes he'd taken from the interviews he'd conducted, he was sure he had found something huge, something that apparently no other investigator had noticed. Sergeant Carter looked through the files one more time, found a phone number, grabbed his cell phone, and made a call. And he told the person who answered that he needed to speak to them as soon as possible about Amy's murder. On June 27th, Carter headed over to this person's house to meet them. But when he got there, the person was gone and nobody seemed to know where they went. Soon, Carter found this person had emptied all their bank accounts, quit their job, and just disappeared without a word to anybody. Sergeant Carter couldn't believe it. For the first time in over 20 years, Indianapolis police thought they might be getting closer to solving Amy's murder. But now the person they needed to talk to had fled. And for all Carter knew, this fugitive could be halfway around the world already. A little over a week later, in early July, Carter was at the station with other officers from several departments. A team of Indianapolis police had been working with different agencies to try to track down the fugitive that they believed might be connected to Amy's murder. And now they were waiting to hear something, anything, that might help with their investigation. Car data, investigators had discovered that the fugitive had rented a car in town. And using that rented car's OnStar security service, they now knew exactly where that car was parked. Carter asked where it was, half expecting it to be on the other side of the country or somewhere across the border. But the officer said that was not the case at all. The rental car was at a house right here in Indianapolis. Minutes later, police cruisers roared down a residential street and pulled up to a house. Carter and the other officers got out of their cars and quickly approached the front door. Right there in the driveway was the fugitive's rental car. As Carter prepared to knock on the door, several other officers around them put their hands on their holsters, ready to draw their weapons. They didn't know if the fugitive was even inside, but they had to be prepared for anything. Once they were ready, Carter knocked on the door. Moments later, a man answered. Carter told the man who they were looking for, and as soon as he did, suddenly there was a scream coming from inside the house. Carter and several other officers bolted inside, and they found the fugitive standing there in the kitchen. And there was blood running down from the slash on their wrist, and they were holding a knife to their own throat, threatening to kill themselves if the cops came any closer. Carter and the other officers took a breath and tried to keep everybody calm. Several officers talked to the fugitive, urging them to put the knife down and to get medical help. and slowly, the tension in the room eased a bit, and the fugitive did drop the knife. At that point, officers rushed the fugitive, trying to stop the bleeding from their wrist, while making sure the fugitive couldn't hurt themselves or any of the officers, or try to make a run for it. An ambulance soon arrived, and paramedics sped the fugitive to the hospital, with police following closely behind. And luckily, the fugitive got medical help just in time. And later that day, after Carter and other investigators got to meet with the fugitive in the hospital, they finally figured out, after more than 20 years, who had killed Amy Widener. Based on information from the fugitive's statements, evidence found at the murder scene, and interviews conducted over the course of multiple investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Amy Widener on the morning of November 13th, 1989. On that day, just after 7:30 a.m., the killer walked through the first floor of Amy's house. They moved slowly, and in their hand they gripped a metal pipe. The killer stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. They thought they heard someone coughing and maybe some laughter coming from the second floor. The killer walked up the stairs as slowly and quietly as they could, and then crept down a hallway towards Amy's bedroom where they heard the noises. Once they reached the door, they threw it open and they saw Amy sitting up in bed with her little girl. Amy screamed and put her baby down on the floor, then she climbed out of bed and leapt at the killer. Amy threw her fists at the killer and fought back as hard as she could as the little girl ran out of the bedroom. The killer wrapped their arms around Amy and shoved her back onto the bed. Amy kept fighting, but the killer raised the metal pipe and struck Amy on the arms and chest, stunning her. And the killer took off Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her. But through it all, Amy continued to fight back, constantly slashing at the killer until the killer was bloodied. But at some point, the killer managed to steady themselves against the wall. They raised their metal pipe again, and they slammed it directly into Amy's forehead. At that point, Amy stopped moving. The strike in her head had killed her. But the killer wanted to be sure she really was dead. So after that, they wrapped their hands around Amy's throat, and they strangled her until they knew she had stopped breathing. Then the killer got up and ran out of the room and down the hall, right past Amy's young daughter. Once the killer was back downstairs, they went into JP's room, threw open the dresser drawers, and grabbed the $50 out of one of them. After pocketing the money, they picked up some stereo equipment and then ran out of the house through the sliding door that led onto the back porch. As the killer ran away, they just hoped nobody had seen them and that maybe they would get away with the horrific act they had just committed against their best friend's sister. Rodney Dank, who was JP's best friend and who would remain close to the family following Amy's murder, had been Amy's killer. It turned out he was able to get away with his crime for over 20 years simply because of an oversight. Initially, the police had Rodney listed as one of Amy's close friends that they would need to interview. But for some reason, nobody ever spoke to him. Rodney did not get questioned in the initial investigation or in the secondary investigation when that man had called in to tell police about his dreams. This oversight was what Sergeant Carter, the nuisance and abatement officer, noticed when he started digging into Amy's case in his spare time. He saw Rodney's name listed in the guest book from Amy's funeral, and then he found Rodney mentioned in other notes from the investigation. But he didn't see any record of Rodney ever being interviewed. So Carter tracked Rodney down and set up a meeting with him. At the time, Carter did not have any idea if Rodney had a connection to the murder or if he could even offer any information. He just wanted to speak to Rodney because nobody ever had. But when Carter went to meet Rodney and realized he had fled, that immediately made Rodney the first major suspect the police had in the case in 2 decades. After police finally caught up to Rodney, they discovered that his palm print matched the bloody print found in Amy's room. And while Rodney was recovering in the hospital, he would confess to what he did to Amy. However, in his confession, he did not make it clear if he had gone to the house with that intent, or if he had simply gone there to rob his best friend JP, and then she had been a target of opportunity. It was also never clear if the man who had called the police in 2002 really experienced those dreams that supposedly showed Amy's murder. And police also don't know what caused that man's violent episode on the day Amy died. However, they do know that that particular man who called in about his dreams had absolutely no involvement in Amy's death. Ultimately, Rodney Dank was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Sergeant Carter was named Investigator of the Year by the Indianapolis Police Department based on his work on this case. As for Amy's daughter, she was raised by Amy's mother, Gloria. And when she reached high school, she actually had Jody George, Amy's favorite teacher, for French. And when she graduated, Jody would tell her, "I just remember so many things about your mother and how your mother felt about you. And I know your mother would be so proud of you right now."
Late on the evening of November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called The Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house, because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other 2 elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, "Hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here?" Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, "Leave me alone." I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other 2 maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, "You know what? I'm fine. I'll finish up. You go lay down. I hope you feel better." By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her nightclothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. I mean, after all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him.
And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home and he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, hey, you should hire John. And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. I mean, Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. I mean, he just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want, no matter what. I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other 2 elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the 2 maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night. And then he made his way into the kitchen and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something, and Emma, she's upstairs and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic, and she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom and she couldn't see Emma anywhere, and her bed was totally on fire. And so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen, where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid, and the 4 of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread, and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the 4 of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the 4 of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all 4 of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head.
John and Elizabeth and the two maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do. And then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all four of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house. And so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So, on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him, but John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell and he led John down the hallway to this room. And when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was. But then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is. And it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templer, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templer, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down. And Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law.
And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kind of acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, well, what did you have for breakfast today? And what's your favorite color? And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not John was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, oh yeah, he's guilty, he killed Emma. And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck. Yeah. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck. Yeah, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever. And each time, John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, you know what? We cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today, we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby, the father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the Glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped, and he flew into this rage, and he began screaming back at Emma, and then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry, he pulled it off, and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head, and Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma, and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma, and if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone, and then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So, in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial, and so that's why as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. We don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trap door and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81.